In 2019, archaeologists discovered something in an ancient Egyptian worker's home that made them question everything they thought they knew about ordinary life along the Nile. The house sat in Deir el-Medina, a settlement where the craftsmen who built the Valley of the Kings once lived. These were the painters, the sculptors, the men who knew pharaonic secrets because they carved them into stone. But beneath the floor of one modest dwelling, researchers found a chamber that shouldn't exist. Inside were objects that didn't belong in the narrative we've been taught. The items weren't treasures. They were stranger than gold. Clay figurines depicting acts that violated temple law. Dried herbs known for inducing visions. Crude drawings on pottery shards, showing rituals that had nothing to do with Osiris or Ra. The chamber had been sealed deliberately, hidden from neighbors, from priests, from history itself. And it wasn't alone. As excavations continued, similar hidden spaces emerged across the workers' village. Each one told the same uncomfortable truth: the Egyptians we think we know never really existed. For over 2 centuries, our understanding of ancient Egypt has been built on a foundation of monuments. We study pharaohs because they left behind pyramids. We read royal inscriptions because they were carved in granite, meant to last forever. But common people didn't build in stone. They lived in mud brick that dissolved back into the Nile Valley dust. Their stories weren't written on temple walls. And so we've constructed an entire civilization from the propaganda of kings, assuming that everyone below them simply served, worshipped, and died content in their cosmic order. The reality hides in places we once ignored. In the 1970s, when archaeologists finally started examining ancient garbage dumps outside Egyptian settlements, they found something unexpected. Thousands of broken pottery shards, covered in hasty ink scribbles. These weren't official documents. They were notes, letters, complaints, shopping lists, and confessions. One fragment records a worker threatening to beat his neighbor over a borrowed tool. Another describes a woman's recipe for a drink that would make the night forget itself. A third mentions a gathering after dark where people did things the priests would burn us for. These scraps of discarded papyrus reveal a parallel world. While pharaohs commissioned texts about divine order and eternal harmony, ordinary Egyptians were writing about debt, infidelity, workplace disputes, and secret ceremonies held beyond the reach of authority. The contrast is jarring. In tombs, we see orderly rows of servants bringing offerings to their masters for eternity. In garbage pits, we see those same servants complaining about back pain, scheming to steal extra grain, and meeting in darkness to worship gods that temples didn't recognize. The double life wasn't an exception. It was survival. Egyptian society placed crushing expectations on its people. Everyone had a role assigned by birth, sanctioned by religion, enforced by law. Farmers farmed, craftsmen crafted, priests maintained cosmic balance through endless ritual. To step outside your designated function was to risk disturbing at the divine order that kept chaos at bay. The punishment could be severe, but humans aren't made for that kind of rigid existence. They bend, they hide, they create spaces where different rules apply. Those hidden chambers in Deir el-Medina weren't anomalies. They were windows into the real Egypt, the one that existed after sunset when temple doors closed and neighbors gathered in whispered circles. The Egypt where workers who spent their days painting paradise on tomb walls went home and sought their own version of escape, where women who publicly honored Hathor privately brewed potions that priests would call witchcraft, where men who built monuments to immortality carved crude figures for rituals that promised something more immediate than the afterlife. We've spent generations admiring the mask, the temples, the statues, the perfectly preserved wisdom texts that present ancient Egypt as a civilization of order and enlightenment. But masks are meant to hide what is underneath, and what is underneath is more human, more desperate, and more familiar than we've allowed ourselves to imagine. The question is, whether common Egyptians lived this double existence. The evidence proves they did. The question is what they were really doing in those hidden hours, and why they felt the need to conceal it so completely that we're only discovering it now. Thousands of years after the last lamp was extinguished, and the last secret whispered into Nile Valley darkness, the bread that fed ancient Egypt's workers contained so much sand and grit that by age 30, Most had ground their teeth down to painful stumps. This wasn't tea-pour baking. It was geology. Desert wind carried fine particles into every stage of grain processing. Sand settled on threshing floors. Grit embedded itself in millstones. By the time flour reached the oven, it contained enough silica to slowly destroy human enamel with every meal. Skulls recovered from worker cemeteries tell the story in bone. Abscesses where teeth once were. Jawbones eroded from chronic infection. Evidence of pain that lasted years before death brought relief. Kemwasit would have known this pain. If he lived in the workers' village at Deir el-Medina around 1250 BCE, he'd have woken before dawn in a house barely larger than a modern prison cell. Mud brick walls. A roof of palm logs and packed earth that leaked during rare rains. No windows, just small vents near the ceiling that let smoke escape from the cooking fire. His family would have slept on reed mats on a floor they shared with vermin. In summer, the interior temperature could reach levels that made sleep nearly impossible. In winter, the same walls that trapped heat during the day offered little protection against desert cold after sunset. His morning meal would have been that same deadly bread, perhaps dipped in onion water if the family had resources for such luxury. Then came work, not the romantic image of artists carefully painting tomb walls, but the brutal reality of preparing those walls. Hauling stone, mixing plaster from limestone and sand, grinding pigments by hand until shoulders ached and fingers bled. The sun didn't take care about artistic vision. It beat down on the valley with temperatures that regularly exceeded 110 degrees. Workers collapsed. Some never rose again. Their names weren't recorded, they were replaced. Archaeological excavations of these villages paint a picture far removed from the Egypt of monuments and mystery. Analysis of bones shows that malnutrition was common even among employed craftsmen. Growth arrest lines appear in teeth, marking periods of childhood starvation. Spines show compression fractures from carrying loads too heavy for human frames. Arm bones display stress markers from repetitive labor that began in childhood and continued until death. The average lifespan hovered around 35 years. Many never saw 40. Disease moved through cramped quarters like wind through papyrus reeds. Parasites from Nile water caused chronic intestinal illness. Flies spread eye infections that led to blindness. Tuberculosis found easy hosts in lungs weakened by dust and smoke. Schistosomiasis, carried by snails in irrigation canals, damaged internal organs slowly and painfully. Medicine existed, but mostly for those who could afford it. Common people relied on folk remedies that sometimes helped and often didn't. They watched their children die of fevers. They buried wives lost in childbirth. They lived with pain that had no cure. And always there was the fear. Fear of famine when the Nile didn't rise high enough. Fear of layoffs when royal building projects ended. Fear of arbitrary punishment from overseers who wielded authority backed by beatings. Fear of debts that could never be repaid, passed down through generations like curses. The cosmic order that supposedly governed Egypt promised everyone a place, but that place for most was a grinding wheel that wore them down grain by grain, year by year, until there was nothing left but used up flesh and stories no one bothered to write down. This was the reality hidden beneath the grandeur. While priests in spotless linen performed rituals in cool temple sanctuaries, workers sweated in the sun. While nobles feasted on roasted duck and imported wine, commoners chewed bread that destroyed their teeth. While pharaohs contemplated eternity, ordinary Egyptians wondered if they'd survive another harvest season. The weight of that existence pressed down on millions of lives across 3,000 years of civilization. Human beings can only endure so much before they seek escape. When every day brings the same exhaustion, the same hunger, the same pain, the mind begins searching for doors out of that prison. Some doors are sanctioned by society. Others exist in shadows, whispered about in careful tones, reached only by those desperate enough to risk everything for a few hours of forgetting. The question wasn't whether people would seek these escapes. The question was what they'd be willing to do to find them, and how far they'd go once those doors opened. When the sun set over ancient Thebes, honest merchants packed up their wares, loading unsold pottery and linen onto carts, heading home to evening meals and legitimate rest. But in the shadows between mud brick buildings, where oil lamps cast more darkness than light, a different kind of trade was just beginning. The same spaces that sold grain and fish during daylight hours transformed after dusk into marketplaces for desires that couldn't be spoken in temple courtyards or palace halls. We know this world existed because people were careless with their garbage. Broken pottery shards called ostraca, discarded in ancient trash heaps, preserve conversations never meant for official record. One fragment from the Ramesside period mentions a meeting at the usual place when the temple guards change. Another references payment for the blue flowers dried and ready. A third warns someone to bring no attention, or we'll all face the lash. These weren't commercial transactions recorded for tax collectors. They were whispers preserved in clay, evidence of commerce that operated beyond the reach of pharaonic authority. The night markets didn't announce themselves. There were no signs, no public locations. Knowledge travelled through networks built on trust and necessity. A worker finishing his shift in the Valley of the Kings might receive a subtle gesture from a colleague, a nod toward a specific alley, a phrase that sounded innocent but carried meaning to those who knew the code. The lotus blooms late tonight. The beer tastes different at Amenhotep's place. My wife needs special oils for her headache. Each phrase was a key that opened doors invisible to outsiders. The merchants who operated these shadow markets were often the same people who sold goods legitimately during the day. A baker known for decent bread might also know where to find herbs that brought visions. A beer seller could point you toward brews mixed with substances that made the world feel softer, more bearable. A woman who sold perfumes and cosmetics in sunlight might offer different preparations after dark, ointments and powders that served purposes having nothing to do with beauty. They operated in plain sight by maintaining two inventories, two sets of relationships, two versions of truth. Archaeological evidence suggests these markets trafficked in three primary categories of forbidden goods. First were substances that altered consciousness or mood. Blue lotus flowers, when properly prepared, produced effects ranging from mild euphoria to vivid dreams. Certain combinations of herbs created drinks that workers called night-forgetting water in private correspondence. Seeds from specific plants, when ground and consumed, made pain disappear along with inhibition. Second were objects connected to unauthorized magic. Amulets invoking gods the temples didn't recognize. Cursed tablets meant to harm rivals or seduce the unwilling. Figurines used in rituals that had nothing to do with official religion. Third were access points to pleasures that violated social order. Arrangements with individuals who provided company and services that respectable Egyptians weren't supposed to desire, let alone purchase. The authorities knew, of course. Officials weren't blind. Papyrus records from the late New Kingdom mention arrests for selling what corrupts Marat and gathering for improper purposes. But enforcement was sporadic and selective. Partly this was practical. How do you police markets that appear and dissolve like smoke? How do you arrest half your workforce? But there was also a tacit understanding that pressure needs release valves. A population ground down by labor and poverty, denied any voice in how they lived, would eventually explode without outlets. The night markets provided those outlets. They were illegal, yes, but functionally tolerated in the way that power often tolerates the vices of the powerless, especially when those vices keep people manageable. The most successful shadow merchants understood psychology better than priests understood theology. They knew that a worker who'd spent 12 hours in brutal heat would pay anything for a few hours of escape. They knew that a woman trapped in a miserable marriage would risk punishment for a potion promising change. They knew that desperation creates customers more loyal than any religious devotion. And so they cultivated networks, protected sources, and moved with the careful precision of people who understood that their trade existed only as long as it remained useful to those who officially condemned it. This wasn't just ancient Egypt's dirty secret. It was the economy beneath the economy, the social structure beneath the cosmic order, the real system that kept civilization functioning, while monuments proclaimed eternal divine harmony. And at the center of this shadow trade, more prevalent than cursed amulets or forbidden encounters, was a substance that grew wild along the Nile, beautiful and deadly, promising escape to anyone desperate enough to risk everything for a taste. The sacred flower that adorns every Egyptian temple wall was hiding ancient Egypt's most open secret. It was their favorite way to get high. The blue lotus, Nymphea caerulea, grows across the Nile delta in shallow waters, its petals opening at dawn and closing at dusk. Artists carved it into stone pillars. Nobles held single blooms in tomb paintings, inhaling their fragrance with expressions we've interpreted as peaceful contemplation. We've called it symbolic, religious, purely decorative. We were wrong about all of it. Chemical analysis conducted in recent years tells a different story. Researchers examining residue from pottery vessels found in workers' homes discovered something unexpected. The fragments contained traces of wine mixed with alkaloids specific to blue lotus. These weren't ceremonial vessels from temples. They were common drinking cups, beer jars, storage containers from houses where regular Egyptians lived and died. The concentrations suggest regular consumption, not occasional ritual use, and the compounds present nuciferin and apophene, are known psychoactives. They produce mild euphoria, relaxation, and heightened sensory perception. In the right doses, they also function as aphrodisiacs. The preparation method appears in texts we once dismissed as recipes for perfume or medicine. Papyrus fragments describe soaking lotus petals in wine for specific durations, sometimes adding honey or dates to mask the bitter taste. One ostracon found at Deir el-Medina gives detailed instructions. Let the flowers sleep in the jar for 7 days. Drink when the moon is full, and your troubles will seem distant as stars. This isn't poetry. It is a recipe passed between people who knew exactly what they were making and why. A partially preserved papyrus from the Ramesside period tells the story of a young scribe named Hori. The text is fragmentary, but the narrative is clear. Hori worked in a temple, recording grain distributions and maintaining accounts. Respectable work, good positions. But the document describes how he began attending gatherings in a potter's house, after dark, where lotus wine flowed freely. At first, he went occasionally, just to relax after long days calculating numbers. Then weekly. Then every night. The text records his decline in phrases that sound remarkably modern. He could not think without the flower. His hand shook when writing. His eyes became distant. The papyrus breaks off before revealing Hori's fate, but another fragment, possibly from the same document, mentions a scribe punished for neglecting the god's work due to corrupting drink. Whether Hori survived his addiction or became a cautionary tale, we'll never know, but his story confirms what the archaeological evidence suggests. Lotus wine wasn't rare or exotic. It was common enough that even educated professionals could develop dependencies. Once you understand what you're looking at, tomb paintings transform. That banquet scene in Nebamun's tomb, where servants offer lotus flowers to seated guests. Look at the guests' faces, the slightly unfocused eyes, the relaxed postures, the intimate positioning of bodies. One woman holds a lotus to her nose with an expression that goes beyond appreciation of fragrance. She is inhaling deeply, eyes half closed, in a pose that suggests this is about more than smell. Another painting from the tomb of Nakht shows a party where every guest clutches lotus blooms. Musicians play, servants pour wine, and everyone, without exception, has that same dreamy expression we've called spiritual serenity, but might better describe as intoxicated bliss. The authorities tried to regulate this. A decree from the reign of Ramesses III specifically mentions excessive consumption of lotus, mixed drink among prohibited behaviors for temple workers. The punishment was 20 lashes and loss of rations for a month, but the decree had to be reissued multiple times, appearing in administrative records from different years. Laws that require constant repetition aren't being followed. They're being ignored by people who've decided the risk is worth the reward. The blue lotus trade wasn't hidden in back alleys. It grew wild. Anyone could harvest it. But knowledge of preparation, ideal concentrations, and best combinations with wine or beer, that knowledge travelled through networks. The potters who made the vessels, the brewers who knew which vintages worked best as bases, the workers who'd experimented enough to understand dosages. An entire informal economy existed around a flower that appeared in every official artwork as a symbol of rebirth and divine beauty. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so deliberate. By making their most popular intoxicant sacred, Egyptians created perfect cover for its recreational use. But blue lotus was mild, socially tolerated, and carried relatively light penalties for overindulgence. It was the gateway, not the destination. for those seeking stronger escapes, for people whose pain went deeper than lotus wine could reach. Ancient Egypt offered darker alternatives, substances that came with severe consequences, but promised oblivion potent enough to make the risk seem worthwhile. In one ancient Egyptian village, archaeologists found a mass grave of 12 people who all died on the same night, with traces of the same forbidden substance in their remains. The burial was hasty, unmarked, located beyond the normal cemetery boundaries. The bodies showed no signs of violence, no indication of disease. They simply stopped living simultaneously. Chemical analysis of bone samples revealed alkaloids, consistent with extremely high doses of substances derived from Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. This wasn't accidental poisoning. This was something else entirely. The opium poppy doesn't appear in Egyptian art with the same frequency as blue lotus, and there is a reason. While lotus grew wild and openly, poppies required cultivation, deliberate care, hidden gardens. Court records from Deir, el-Medina document cases of workers punished for maintaining secret plots behind their homes. One ostracon, from the reign of Rameses IV, describes a man named Panib, who was caught with sleep flowers growing in clay pots concealed beneath his house. The punishment was brutal 50 lashes, confiscation of property, and forced labor in the quarries. Yet 3 years later, another record mentions Panib again, this time caught selling dried poppy bulbs. The punishment didn't stop him, it just made him more careful. Opium offered something blue lotus couldn't complete escape. Not mild euphoria, but absolute dissolution of pain, physical and existential. Workers with chronic injuries from decades of hard labor. People living with untreatable diseases. Those who simply couldn't bear another day in their assigned cosmic role. They sought poppies, and they found suppliers who understood the demand. Some of those suppliers wore priestly linen. A damaged papyrus fragment references an investigation into a temple official named Userhat who used knowledge of growing things for personal gain. The text describes how he cultivated poppies in temple gardens, claiming they were for legitimate medical purposes. Some genuinely were. Egyptian physicians used opium to treat severe pain, to calm difficult childbirths, to ease the dying, but Userhat also sold prepared opium outside official channels, using his religious position as cover. When caught, he claimed he was helping people the official medical system ignored. He may have been right, but the authorities cared more about unauthorized commerce than compassionate care. Mandrake root offered different dangers. Mandragora officinarum contains tropane alkaloids that produce vivid hallucinations, delirium, and at higher doses, death. Egyptians knew this plant well. Medical papyri warn of its power while acknowledging its uses. But those uses rarely matched how people actually employed it. A court case recorded on limestone flakes tells of a woman named Haria, arrested for providing mandrake preparations to village women. The charges were specific. She used the root to induce abortions, ending pregnancies that would have brought shame or hardship. Mandrake's hallucinogenic properties were side effects she apparently exploited, offering women visions during the procedure, telling them they'd seen goddesses who approved of their choice. Heria's house, when excavated centuries later, revealed a hidden preparation area. Stone mortars stained with residue, clay vessels with traces of various plant compounds, tools for grinding, mixing, measuring. She wasn't an amateur. She was a professional operating an illegal pharmacy from her home, serving needs that official society wouldn't acknowledge existed. Her fate is recorded, execution by drowning, but the demand she served didn't die with her. The combination of drugs created unpredictable effects. Opium and mandrake mixed with wine and lotus could produce experiences ranging from ecstatic to fatal. The mass grave suggests a gathering where this combination went catastrophically wrong. Scattered pottery near the burial site contained residues of all three substances in concentrations, far exceeding typical usage. Whether this was ritual, recreational excess, or collective suicide remains uncertain. What is clear is that 12 people consumed a mixture that stopped their hearts within hours of each other. The bodies were buried quickly, without proper ritual, suggesting authorities wanted the incident forgotten. No names recorded, no families acknowledged, just a hole in the ground beyond the village limits, 12 corpses thrown together, covered with sand and silence. The message was clear. This is what happens when you go too far beyond sanctioned boundaries. when you seek escapes that the cosmic order doesn't permit. But the message didn't stop the seeking. Hidden gardens continued growing forbidden flowers. Stone mortars continued grinding dangerous roots, and people continued choosing risk over the certainty of their grinding daily existence. The substances altered minds, removed inhibitions, made bodies feel different, more alive or blessedly numb, and when inhibitions fell away completely, other forbidden desires emerged from shadows, desires that had nothing to do with plants or potions, and everything to do with flesh. Ancient Egyptian workers were willing to trade a month's wages for a single vial of concentrated lotus essence. What made it worth risking everything? The answer lies not in the substance itself, but in what it offered, a temporary exit from a life with no other doors. And where demand exists at that level of desperation, an economy emerges, complete with supply chains, pricing structures, and participants willing to accept extraordinary risk for extraordinary profit. The supply chain began in hidden places, small plots behind houses, carefully tended after dark, desert wadis, where poppies grew in soil enriched by animal waste, temple gardens, where certain priests cultivated more than medicinal herbs. Farmers who grew these forbidden plants faced execution if caught. Yet many calculated that the risk was preferable to the certainty of grinding poverty. A single successful poppy harvest could earn what 3 years of legitimate farming provided. That mathematics kept hidden gardens flourishing, despite periodic crackdowns. Transport required creativity. Dried lotus flowers could be hidden in shipments of legitimate herbs. Poppy bulbs were concealed inside hollow bread loaves, or wrapped in linen and labelled as burial materials. One ingenious merchant, whose activities are documented in court records, hollowed out wooden tool handles and filled them with concentrated preparations, shipping them across Egypt as ordinary carpenter supplies. He operated successfully for years before an informant exposed him. His punishment was severe, but his methods were copied by others who learned from his one mistake, trusting someone the prices reflected the risk. Household accounts written on pottery shards reveal spending patterns that would seem insane to modern economists. One family's records show that over a 6-month period, they spent 60 Deben worth of goods, roughly 3 months of a skilled worker's wages, on lotus wine and preparations. Their food purchases for the same period totaled 45 Deben. They were literally choosing intoxication over adequate nutrition. Another ostrakon documents a man selling his labor for 2 years to pay off debts accumulated from purchasing opium. He essentially sold himself into temporary slavery for substances that offered a few hours of relief. Corruption oiled the machinery. Officials who should have enforced laws against these trades often became participants in them. A fragmentary papyrus describes an overseer who collected regular payments from known drug merchants in exchange for advance warning of inspections. Temple administrators who publicly condemned intoxication sometimes rented storage space to dealers, taking percentages of profits while maintaining plausible deniability. The system was hypocritical, but it was stable. Everyone involved understood the rules of this shadow game. Temples occupied a particularly complex position. Official religious doctrine condemned excessive intoxication as disrupting Marat. Priests delivered sermons about purity and restraint. Yet many temples possessed extensive botanical knowledge and garden spaces ideal for cultivation. Evidence suggests that some temples operated legitimate medical preparation of substances, while quietly allowing surplus to enter recreational markets. The distinction between medicine and vice depended largely on who was buying and what they claimed to need it for. Temples profited from both sides of that blurry line. The most dramatic evidence of how embedded these substances were in society comes from the reign of Rameses III. Administrative records describe his attempt to eliminate poppy cultivation through harsh enforcement. He increased penalties, conducted raids, and appointed special inspectors. The result was a revolt among the very workers building his mortuary temple. They walked off the job, the first documented labor strike in history. Their demands included resumption of normal rations, but also, tellingly, cessation of harassment regarding private gardens and personal trades. The pharaoh backed down. He had to. You cannot build monuments without workers, and workers who see no escape from their existence will not work peacefully. The crackdown was quietly abandoned. Gardens returned, trade resumed, and the economic machinery of escape continued operating as it had before, as it would for centuries after, because prohibition never addresses the underlying reason people seek oblivion. That reason was simple: existence hurt too much to bear unaltered, and when substances made the world softer, more tolerable, they also made other forbidden things seem less forbidden. Inhibitions dissolved. Bodies felt different. Desires emerged that daylight and sobriety kept hidden. The drugs were never just about escape from pain. They were gateways to other violations, other pleasures that Egyptian society condemned but couldn't eliminate, pleasures that had everything to do with touch, hunger, and the bodies of others. Hidden in a tomb for 3,000 years, archaeologists found a papyrus so sexually explicit that it wasn't published for decades, and it was created by common workers, not nobles. The Turin erotic papyrus, discovered in the early 19th century, depicts 12 vignettes of sexual encounters between a somewhat overweight man and a woman in various positions. When scholars first examined it, they were scandalized. This wasn't religious. It wasn't symbolic. It was straightforward pornography from ancient Egypt, drawn with the same skill used to decorate royal tombs. The artist clearly worked in the Valley of the Kings. The techniques matched official artwork, but this was never meant for pharaoh size. For decades, the papyrus was hidden in museum storage, considered too obscene for public display. Scholars who studied it often didn't publish their findings, unwilling to attach their names to ancient pornography. But its existence posed uncomfortable questions. If workers were creating explicit material with this level of artistic skill, what else were they producing? The answer emerged gradually as excavations of worker villages revealed similar content everywhere. Archaeologists looked. The walls of worker quarters in Deir el-Medina contained graffiti that official tours never mention, crude sketches of sexual acts, explicit poems scratched into mud brick, caricatures of priests and nobles in compromising positions. One particularly detailed drawing shows a man and woman in a position that would have been considered deeply inappropriate by temple standards, accompanied by text that roughly translates to a vulgar boast about sexual prowess. These weren't hidden in private spaces. They were on exterior walls where anyone walking by could see them. The message was defiant. We know what you forbid, and we don't care. Ostraca. Those pottery fragments Egyptians used as scratch paper tell an even more revealing story. Workers in the Valley of the Kings had breaks between shifts. They sit in shade, drink beer, and pass time. Many passed it by drawing. Excavations have recovered dozens of pottery shards, depicting explicit sexual content. The drawings vary in quality from crude stick figures to surprisingly detailed artwork. Workers apparently traded these like modern people collect cards, each one more explicit than the last. One collection found in a single house contained 17 different ostraca, each showing different positions or scenarios. This was someone's private collection of ancient pornography, stashed away for personal viewing. The network of scribes who could read and write serviced this demand in more sophisticated ways. Literacy was rare among common Egyptians, making written texts valuable. Some scribes realized they could profit by copying erotic literature. Fragmentary papyri, recovered from garbage dumps, contain passages describing sexual techniques in explicit detail. These weren't medical texts. They were entertainment, instruction manuals for activities that religious doctrine didn't officially acknowledge existed. The texts describe positions, techniques for prolonging pleasure, and methods of seduction that suggest a thriving oral tradition of sexual knowledge passing through generations of common people who had no access to official education. Certain establishments catered specifically to these interests. Taverns near worker villages officially sold beer and simple food, but evidence suggests many functioned as venues for entertainment that went far beyond drinking. Ostraca mention the dancers at Cassius Place and the women who perform after dark in contexts that make clear we're not discussing religious ceremonies. One partially preserved text describes a performance where a dancer removed her clothing piece by piece while musicians played, eventually engaging in explicit acts with audience members who paid extra. The language is frank, transactional, devoid of romance or religious meaning. This was commercial sex entertainment, operating openly enough that people wrote about it casually. Temple authorities condemned all of this. Of course, official doctrine held that sexual activity served procreation within marriage, governed by strict rules about purity and timing. Anything outside those boundaries disrupted cosmic order, but enforcement was sporadic and selective. A priest caught with erotic ostraca would face serious punishment. A common worker might receive a warning or small fine, if caught at all. The double standard was understood by everyone. Those who maintained Marat publicly were allowed their private deviations, while those who maintained Marat were expected to be grateful for the privilege of their oppression. What the Turin Papyrus and its companions reveal isn't just that ancient Egyptians had sex drives, it is that they actively resisted the moral framework imposed upon them. Every crude drawing was a small rebellion. Every copied erotic text was a rejection of priestly authority. Every night of entertainment at underground taverns was a declaration that cosmic order didn't govern their bedrooms. They couldn't openly challenge the system that controlled their lives, but they could, in darkness and secrecy, create a parallel world where different rules applied, where pleasure mattered more than purity, where bodies belonged to their owners rather than to pharaohs and gods. And some took it further, beyond casual entertainment and private collections. Beyond the boundaries even these underground markets acknowledged, existed relationships and practices, so forbidden that discovery meant death. These were the true transgressions, the desires that couldn't be satisfied with drawn images or dancer performances, the hungers that required real bodies and real risks. The love poem started innocently enough, carved into a pottery shard, discovered in a worker's house near Thebes. The handwriting was educated, the grammar impeccable. "Your eyes hold the Nile at sunset," it read. "Your voice is sweeter than honey from the delta." Romantic words that would seem unremarkable, except for two details revealed through careful analysis. First, the handwriting matched administrative documents written by a priest named Amenemope. Second, the poem was addressed to Mutemwia, a woman whose name appears in marriage records as the wife of a stonecutter named Kemwaset. This wasn't a husband's affection. It was evidence of adultery involving a temple official who'd sworn purity. Egyptian society was built on rigid boundaries. Social class determined who you could marry, love, even speak to with familiarity. A farmer's daughter might as well have lived on a different planet from a nobleman's son. The cosmic order demanded everyone remain in their assigned place, including their romantic attachments. But human desire doesn't recognize cosmic order. It follows its own rules, obeying wants that society can forbid but never eliminate. Court documents preserve fragments of such transgressions. One case from Deir el-Medina tells of Nefertari, daughter of a baker named Pendua. She caught the attention of a Wab priest during a festival procession. Wab priests performed purification rituals, required to maintain absolute ritual cleanliness, contact with common people, especially women outside specific religious contexts, violated their sacred status. But Nefertari was beautiful, and the priest was young, and desire is stronger than vows. They met in an abandoned tomb on the outskirts of the necropolis. The location wasn't random. Tombs provided privacy, while remaining close enough to both their worlds. For months they continued their meetings, the priest claiming night rituals, Nefertari inventing errands for her family. The relationship ended when a night guard, making rounds, heard sounds from a tomb that should have been silent. He investigated. The discovery led to immediate arrest. Nefertari was beaten publicly, her family shamed. The priest's punishment was worse. Stripped of his position, he faced execution for defiling his sacred office. The last record of him is a notation in an administrative log. The former priest, who forgot his purity, has been given to the crocodiles. Yet such stories didn't stop others. Certain festivals became notorious for illicit encounters. The Opit festival, celebrating the flooding of the Nile, involved processions, feasting, and beer flowing freely. In the chaos and celebration, normal social boundaries softened. Nobles mixed with commoners. Married people found themselves dancing with strangers. What happened in the darkness between official ceremonies stayed there, and understood collective amnesia. Ostraca references, Opit arrangements suggest organized encounters, possibly even temporary partner exchanges among worker communities who used the festival's cover for activities they'd never dare attempt. Otherwise magical love spells offered another avenue for forbidden desire. Fragmentary papyri preserve spells designed to compel attraction, break up marriages, or cause specific individuals to feel overwhelming lust. Make the heart of Henotawi burn for Paneb, as fire burns through papyrus. One spell demands, invoking gods that temples didn't recognize. These spells were sold by practitioners working from homes and market stalls, charging desperate lovers prices that reflected the risks they took. Whether the spells worked is irrelevant. The fact that people paid for them reveals the depth of desires they couldn't fulfill through sanctioned means. Hidden rooms in excavated houses suggest permanent infrastructure for secret encounters. Certain dwellings contained spaces accessible only through concealed entrances, too elaborate to be simple storage. These were meeting places, maintained by households who profited from providing privacy to lovers who couldn't safely meet elsewhere. One house in particular, belonging to a widow named Takat, appears to have specialized in these arrangements. Multiple hidden chambers, each accessible separately, allowed discrete simultaneous use. Takat wasn't just providing a service, she was running a business. The most shocking revelations involved temples themselves. Texts recently translated from damaged papyri describe systematic prostitution organized by temple dancers. These women, officially employed to perform sacred dances during ceremonies, apparently supplemented income through arrangements with wealthy patrons. The operation was sophisticated. Dancers met clients in specific locations, used coded language, and paid percentages to temple administrators who facilitated and protected the trade. The texts suggest this wasn't isolated deviance, it was organized, tolerated, and profitable for institutions that publicly championed moral purity. These violations of social and sexual boundaries occurred alongside violations of religious boundaries. When people stopped respecting the sanctity of marriage, of social class, of temple purity, they inevitably stopped respecting the sanctity of religious practice itself, twisting sacred rituals to serve profane desires. The rental agreement seemed innocent, just a woman renting rooms to travelers. The papyrus fragment, discovered in a house at Deir el-Medina, lists terms for short-term accommodation, payment of 2 deben per night, discretion assured, no questions. Standard language for temporary lodging. But the archaeological evidence tells a very different story about what happened behind those mud brick walls. Chemical analysis of the floors revealed traces of perfumed oils used nowhere else in the village. The layout included multiple small rooms accessible from a central chamber, and pottery fragments found in the courtyard contained explicit images of commercial sexual transactions. This wasn't an inn, it was a brothel. Egyptian law didn't explicitly prohibit prostitution, creating a grey area that enterprising individuals exploited. Officially, sex outside marriage violated Marat and could be punished. Practically, authorities couldn't monitor every transaction between consenting adults. The solution was an open secret: establishments that officially sold beer or rented rooms while actually trading in bodies. Everyone knew. Few interfered. The cosmic order could be maintained as long as no one forced the authorities to acknowledge what they'd chosen to ignore. The woman who ran the most notorious of these establishments was named Takat. Her name appears repeatedly in ostraca from the late New Kingdom period, usually in context that makes her profession clear. Going to Takat's place tonight. One fragment records, bring 3 deben if you want the young one, another advises. Court records show she was arrested twice, both times for operating a house of disorder. Both times she was released after paying fines. The second arrest document notes that many respected workers testified on her behalf, suggesting she had customers in positions of influence. Takat's operation was sophisticated. She employed women, some widows like herself, others unmarried and desperate. She maintained informants who warned of impending raids. She paid protection money to officials who ensured inspections found nothing incriminating. Her house had escape routes, hidden spaces where people could disappear if authorities arrived unexpectedly. This wasn't amateur vice. It was professional criminality operating with the tacit consent of a system that needed such outlets to exist. Religious festivals provided another context for commercial sex. The beautiful Feast of the Valley, honoring the dead, involved processions to the necropolis, where families held overnight vigils at tomb sites. But not everyone attending had family in those tombs. Certain individuals set up temporary encampments, offering food, beer, and other services to festival goers. Archaeological surveys of these necropolis areas have revealed traces of temporary structures, concentrations of pottery and refuse suggesting heavy use, and graffiti explicitly describing sexual transactions. One tomb chamber shows evidence of modification for secular use, with carved images that suggest group activities involving multiple participants. The consequences of this trade were brutal. Children born from these encounters had no legal fathers, marking them as social outcasts from birth. Some women involved in prostitution appear in medical records, seeking treatment for diseases spread through sexual contact. Violence was common. One ostracon describes a fight at a brothel where a customer attacked a worker, resulting in serious injury. The woman survived, but was left disfigured. There is no record of the customer facing punishment. Most disturbing are hints that temples themselves participated in commercial prostitution. A damaged papyrus describes an investigation into a temple of Hathor, where sacred women engaged in transactions with visitors that went beyond ritual. The text suggests temple administrators received portions of the income, effectively operating a brothel under religious cover. Whether this was common or exceptional remains unclear, but the existence of even one documented case suggests the practice occurred elsewhere. The hypocrisy was staggering. Institutions responsible for maintaining moral order profiting from behavior they publicly condemned. The sexual economy of ancient Egypt operated on the same principles as the drug trade. Desperation created supply. Desire created demand. Officials condemned both, while ensuring neither disappeared entirely, and ordinary Egyptians, trapped in lives offering little pleasure or control, took what escapes they could find, whether through substances that altered their minds or encounters that altered their bodies. But perhaps the most profound rebellion wasn't found in bedrooms or drug-induced stupors. It existed in the realm of belief itself, where commoners took the religion they'd been given and twisted it into something personal, powerful, and absolutely forbidden. The clay figure was crudely made, but the iron nail driven through its head was very real, as was the name carved on its chest of a local tax collector who died mysteriously 3 days later. The figurine was discovered in 1923, buried beneath the threshold of a house in Deir el-Medina. When archaeologists excavated the surrounding area, they found 17 more similar figures, each pierced with metal, each bearing a name. This was religious devotion. This was systematic supernatural warfare waged by ordinary Egyptians against people they couldn't fight through legitimate means. State religion promised cosmic order, divine justice, protection for the righteous. But cosmic justice moves slowly, and sometimes not at all. The overseer who beats you today will beat you tomorrow unless something stops him. The rival who stole your lover won, suddenly develop conscience. The tax collector extracting grain you need to survive, doesn't he care about your children's hunger? Official prayers to official gods offered comfort, but rarely changed circumstances. So people found other gods, other methods, other practitioners who promised results that temples could deliver. The curse, making industry operated openly enough to have established markets and pricing. Clay was cheap. Knowledge was expensive. Anyone could form a human figure from Nile mud. But knowing which words to speak, which demons to invoke, which rituals would channel hatred into supernatural force, that required specialists. These practitioners worked from homes and workshops, advertising through word of mouth, charging fees that reflected both their skill and their risk. A simple curse, just words and clay, might cost 1 deben. A complex ritual involving multiple components and days of preparation could require 10 deben or more. And for curses that promised death, prices climbed higher still. The materials told their own story. Excavations of suspected curse makers, workshops have revealed inventories that read like inventories of supernatural war, hundreds of small clay figures in various stages of completion, pots of red ochre and black ink for writing names, collections of nails, needles, and sharp objects for piercing. Papyri containing spells in languages that weren't Egyptian, borrowing from foreign traditions that promised darker powers. Some of these practitioners had clearly obtained materials from temples through theft or bribed contacts. One workshop contained wax that matched temple supplies, suggesting inside help from someone with access to sacred stores. The curses themselves varied in ambition and malice. Execration texts, Clay bowls, or figures inscribed with curses, appear by the hundreds in ancient garbage dumps and buried in cemeteries. Many target specific individuals with specific harms. May Amenhotep's tongue swell in his mouth, so he cannot speak lies about me. May Mutemwaya's womb remain closed, so she bears no children to her new husband. May Kamwasit stumble in the quarry and lose his arms, so he can never raise them against another worker. The specificity is chilling. These weren't abstract wishes. They were detailed desires for particular suffering inflicted on named individuals. The most dramatic example comes from a village near Thebes, where an entire community participated in cursing their tax collector. The evidence emerged from a mass burial of cursed objects found outside the settlement. 63 clay figures, all depicting the same person, all inscribed with the same name, all mutilated in different ways. Some had nails through eyes, others showed carved wounds across throats. Several had their hands bound with actual cord. The ritual must have involved dozens of participants, each contributing their own curse, their own manifestation of hatred. The tax collector did die, though whether from supernatural causes or more direct intervention remains unclear. The curses were buried afterward, hidden from authorities who would have punished such organized rebellion. The darkest practices involved substances more disturbing than clay. Several curse texts specify requirements for blood of the cursed, or tears gathered in secret, or seed of man mixed with menstrual flow. These weren't symbolic ingredients. Curse makers needed actual bodily fluids, requiring victims to obtain them through deception or theft. One papyrus describes a curse requiring the target to unknowingly consume their own blood mixed in wine. Another instructs the curse maker to obtain hair from the victim and burn it while speaking names of demons who dwell in darkness beyond the reach of Ra's light. But curses were only half the equation. For every person trying to harm an enemy, another sought to bend fate toward fortune, love, or power through magic that official religion condemned as corrupting the cosmic order. The merchant claimed he was selling ordinary medicine, but when authorities searched his shop, they found jars filled with powdered human skull, each labeled with the deceased's name and cause of death. The discovery occurred during a routine inspection in the market district of Thebes around 1200 BCE. What officials initially assumed was a simple violation of trading regulations became something far more disturbing. The merchant, whose name appears in records as Paza, kept meticulous inventory. Each jar noted not just the identity of the deceased but specific details. Nefertiti died in childbirth, Amenhotep executed for theft, Baconmut virgin fever. This wasn't random grave robbery. It was systematic harvesting of human remains for magical purposes. The demand existed because the most powerful spells required the most forbidden ingredients. Official temple magic used incense, oils, and prayers. Underground practitioners promised results that required darker materials. Human bone, ground to powder, appeared in recipes for binding spells and protection amulets. The logic was sympathetic, human essence containing human power. But not all human remains held equal value. The magical properties supposedly varied based on how the person died and who they were in life. The bones of executed criminals carried the energy of violent death. The skull of a virgin contained untapped potential. The remains of someone who died in extreme emotion, terror, rage, passion held residue of that intensity. Grave robbers serviced this market with practiced efficiency. Tomb robberies weren't just about stealing jewelry and gold. Thieves took pieces of mummies, cutting away hands, removing hearts, cracking open skulls to extract brain matter. Court records document numerous arrests for violation of the eternal rest, where the stolen goods included body parts rather than treasures. One case describes 3 men caught with a cart containing bones from at least 7 different individuals, separated and catalogued for sale. Their punishment was execution, but their operation suggests a supply chain meeting steady demand. Secret societies formed around the most extreme practices. These groups met in abandoned tombs in the necropolis, spaces already associated with death and therefore suitable for rituals invoking powers beyond official religion. Fragmentary texts describe ceremonies where participants mixed their own blood with that of sacrificed animals, creating substances believed to hold tremendous magical potency. One partially preserved papyrus outlines a ritual requiring 12 participants to each contribute blood, which was then combined with the blood of a black goat killed during the ceremony. The resulting mixture supposedly granted protection against enemies and supernatural harm. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavations of certain houses have revealed hidden altars, usually in cellars or concealed rooms, stained with substances that chemical analysis confirms as blood. Some altars show evidence of repeated use over years, suggesting ongoing practices rather than single desperate acts. The altars typically include carved symbols that don't match official religious iconography, borrowed from foreign traditions, or invented by practitioners claiming direct communication with entities temples didn't acknowledge. The most disturbing texts describe rituals requiring blood from specific types of people. One spell promising absolute power over another person. Will requires blood of a virgin taken during the dark moon. Another curse designed to cause sterility calls for menstrual blood from a woman who has birthed 5 sons. A protection spell demands 3 drops of blood from a man about to die. Obtaining these ingredients required either deception or commerce. Some practitioners apparently paid people to provide their blood, creating a literal market in human essence. The desperate and poor could sell their blood for prices ranging from half a Deben to 3 Deben, depending on their circumstances and the blood's perceived magical value. Women who'd recently given birth commanded premium prices. Executed criminals, if practitioners could bribe guards for access, provided blood believed especially potent for curses. The economy was grotesque but rational within its own logic. People had needs. Magic promised solutions. The most powerful magic required the most extreme ingredients. And in a society where most people had nothing, some discovered that their bodies contained commodities they could sell. This wasn't occasional deviance by isolated individuals. The scale of evidence suggests systematic practices involving hundreds or thousands of participants across centuries. The fragments we've recovered represent a tiny percentage of what once existed. For every documented curse or ritual, dozens more left no trace. And where individuals practiced dark magic alone, others gathered in groups, forming communities bound by shared secrets and shared transgression against everything official society held sacred. The cave paintings looked like typical religious art until archaeologists realized the figures weren't worshipping gods. They were devouring them. The chamber sits deep in the limestone cliffs, west of Thebes, accessible only through a narrow passage that requires crawling. Inside, the walls display scenes that superficially resemble temple reliefs. Human figures surround divine forms in poses that could be interpreted as reverence. But closer examination reveals disturbing details. The human figures have mouths opened impossibly wide. The divine forms show wounds, pieces missing, and the hieroglyphic text, badly damaged but partially readable, describes consuming the power of the eternal ones to become eternal ourselves. This wasn't sanctioned worship. This was something else entirely, practiced by commoners who'd taken religious concepts and twisted them into beliefs that would have gotten them executed if discovered. Secret cults flourished in ancient Egypt's shadows, gathering in hidden spaces where official priests never ventured, performing rituals that inverted everything temple religion taught about proper relationship between humans and divine forces. The cult of Set's dark aspect represents the most documented example. Set occupied a complex position in Egyptian religion, god of chaos, storms, foreigners, necessary disorder within cosmic order. Official worship acknowledged his role while containing his destructive potential. But some workers in the quarries and construction sites developed different relationship with Set. They didn't see chaos as something to contain. They saw it as weapon against the order that crushed them. Fragmentary texts describe rituals where cult members performed deliberate acts of violence against symbols of authority, destroying royal statues, desecrating small shrines, even attacking overseers during ceremonies they believed channeled Set's chaotic power into their own bodies. Initiation into these cults involved ordeals, designed to break normal consciousness and rebuild it according to cult logic. One partially preserved papyrus describes an initiation requiring the candidate to consume a mixture of substances that produced terrifying visions while being subjected to physical pain, burned with hot metal, cut with knives, sexually assaulted by multiple cult members. The ordeal lasted an entire night. Those who survived emerged transformed, believing they'd died and been reborn as something no longer fully human. Whether this particular text describes real practice or represents exaggerated warning literature remains debated, but archaeological evidence of hidden initiation chambers with restraints and altars stained with blood suggests some version of such ordeals occurred. Foreign cults found fertile ground among Egyptian commoners exposed to traders and prisoners from conquered territories. One cult, apparently originating in Syria or Canaan, promised immortality through consumption of human flesh. Court records from the reign of Rameses IX described the investigation and brutal suppression of this group. They'd obtained bodies of executed criminals through bribed guards, performing ceremonies where members ate portions of the flesh while chanting in languages Egyptian officials couldn't understand. The cult was small, perhaps 20 members, but its practices were considered so abhorrent that authorities not only executed those caught, but attempted to erase all record of their names and identities. Mass gatherings occurred in desert locations far from settlements. Archaeological surveys have discovered caves containing evidence of large assemblies, pottery fragments suggesting hundreds of vessels, fire pits indicating substantial cooking, and wall carvings mixing Egyptian divine imagery with foreign symbols. These weren't isolated hermits. These were coordinated events requiring organization and communication networks. The gatherings apparently occurred during specific celestial events, with some caves showing astronomical alignments, suggesting timing linked to stars or moon phases. Perhaps most disturbing was the cult that worshipped disease demons. Traditional Egyptian religion saw disease as attack by hostile supernatural forces to be repelled through protective magic. But this group inverted the relationship. They believed deliberately contracting diseases granted supernatural power, making them immune to further harm while channeling the demon's destructive energy against enemies. Evidence comes from a mass burial near Thebes, where dozens of bodies show signs of deliberate infection with the same disease, arranged in ritual positions, with amulets invoking entities' official religion, classified as demons to be destroyed rather than worshipped. Whether they achieved power or simply died horribly from preventable illness, the archaeological record can't determine. These cults represented ultimate rebellion against cosmic order. If official religion promised everyone their place in divine harmony, these groups rejected that harmony entirely, seeking power through inversion of every sacred principle. But spiritual rebellion was only one form of escape. Others sought not supernatural power, but material gain, willing to risk everything in games of chance that destroyed as many families as they enriched. The workman's diary started with careful records of his wages, tracking deben earned, beer rations received, bread allocated to his family. The handwriting is neat, organized, the marks of someone who understood numbers and consequences. Then the entries change. Amounts gambled, amounts lost. The handwriting becomes erratic, desperate. The final entry, written in what appears to be a shaking hand, reads, "I have nothing left. They will take my sons. May the gods forgive what I've done to my blood." The diary belonged to a man named Chemwaset, a mason working at Deir el-Medina around 1150 BCE. We know his name because it appears in legal documents describing how his two young sons were sold into servitude to satisfy gambling debts their father could never repay. Egyptian law officially condemned gambling. Legal texts classify it alongside theft and assault as disruptions of ma'at. The reasoning was sound. Gambling produced winners and losers through pure chance, rather than skill or virtue, violating the cosmic principle that everyone should occupy their proper place through natural order. But laws against fundamental human impulses rarely work. People want the thrill of risk, the possibility of sudden fortune, the escape from grinding predictability, and so they gambled constantly, everywhere, using anything they could wager. The simplest games used knucklebones from sheep or goats, cleaned and dried until they could be tossed like dice. Each bone could land in 4 stable positions, creating enough variation for betting. Workers would crouch in circles during breaks, tossing bones and calling out combinations, wagering bread, beer, or small copper pieces. Archaeological sites across Egypt yield thousands of these gaming bones, worn smooth from handling, some marked with dots or symbols suggesting attempts to weight outcomes. More sophisticated games required boards and pieces. Senet, the most popular board game, appears in tomb paintings where nobles play for spiritual stakes in the afterlife, but commoners played for material stakes in the present. Senet boards carved into stone benches outside workers' houses show deep wear patterns indicating extensive use. The game combined strategy with chance, moves determined by throwing sticks or bones. Skilled players could improve their odds, but fortune ultimately decided outcomes. This made it perfect for gambling. Skill meant something, giving players illusion of control, but chance meant anything could happen, keeping hope alive even for the desperate and unlucky. Certain taverns specialized in gambling, operating semi-openly despite official prohibition. One establishment excavated near Memphis contained a back room with benches arranged around a central space perfect for gaming. The floor was littered with gaming pieces, knuckle bones, and pottery shards recording debts. Some shards list names and amounts. Hanibos 3 Deben. Amenhotep must pay 5 Deben by month's end or forfeit his tools. These weren't casual wagers. These were serious debts recorded because amounts involved were significant enough to require documentation. Cheating was endemic. Excavated gaming pieces show signs of alteration. Weighted dice, marked surfaces, pieces shaved to roll in predictable ways. One particularly ingenious fraud involved a Senet board with hidden channels beneath the playing surface, allowing the owner to subtly tilt the board and influence piece movement. The device was discovered in a house at Deir el-Medina, suggesting even in close-knit communities where everyone knew everyone, people still tried to cheat their neighbors. The consequences of gambling losses extended far beyond immediate financial harm. A legal document from Thebes describes a case where a man gambled away his house, forcing his family onto the streets. Another ostrakon mentions a dispute where a gambler, unable to pay debts, was beaten so severely he couldn't eat work for months, creating further poverty. Most disturbing are contracts showing debt inheritance. When gamblers died owing money, their children inherited the obligation. If children could pay, they could be sold into servitude, their labor considered compensation for their father's debts. Violence naturally followed when debts grew too large and patience wore too thin. One fragmentary papyrus describes a gambling den murder where a winner was stabbed by a losing opponent who'd wagered everything. Another text mentions a riot that erupted when players discovered their host was using loaded dice. 3 men died in the ensuing fight. Authorities arrested survivors, but the gambling continued in other locations with other players because prohibition of human nature never works. It just drives the activity deeper into shadows, where violence becomes the only enforcement mechanism for debts that can't be collected through legitimate means. And when gambling debts became impossible to repay, when families faced starvation or slavery, when violence from creditors seemed imminent, desperate men turned to the only option remaining, taking from others what chance had taken from them. The skeleton showed multiple healed fractures, typical of a laborer. The left arm had broken and mended poorly. Several ribs showed old compression fractures. The spine displayed wear consistent with decades of heavy lifting. Nothing unusual for a construction worker in ancient Egypt, except for the teeth marks on his forearm that clearly came from something that wasn't human. The puncture patterns matched a large cat, possibly a leopard or young lion, and the man's hands showed damage inconsistent with any legitimate trade. Knuckles shattered and rebuilt multiple times. Finger bones broken in patterns, suggesting repeated striking of hard surfaces. This wasn't a worker who occasionally fought. This was someone whose life revolved around violence. Gambling on dice and boards satisfied some appetites, but for certain men, vicarious thrills weren't enough. They wanted blood. They wanted to watch bodies collide, to hear bones break, to witness one man dominate another through pure physical force. And they wanted to bet on outcomes in contests where skill mattered more than chance, where they could study fighters and make calculated wagers that felt more like investment than gambling. Underground fight clubs emerged wherever workers congregated. The evidence appears in medical papyri that describe injuries no legitimate labor would produce. One text details treatment for a man whose jaw was broken backward into his throat, requiring the physician to reset the bone from inside the mouth. Another describes compound fractures of both forearms, sustained simultaneously. Impossible in any accident, but easily explained by blocking repeated strikes. Death certificates occasionally mention died from injuries in a fall, when the actual injuries suggest beating rather than accident. The rings operated in spaces authorities rarely visited. Abandoned quarries provided natural amphitheatres, with stone walls ensuring noise didn't carry. Certain tombs in the necropolis, old and partially collapsed, offered enclosed spaces where torches could burn without being seen from outside. One particularly elaborate arena, discovered in a played-out limestone quarry near Thebes, showed evidence of extensive modification, stone benches carved into walls, a cleared central space, drainage channels suggesting they washed blood away between bouts. This wasn't impromptu violence, this was organized entertainment. Fighters came from the desperate and the damaged, men with nothing to lose, crippling debts, or simply an appetite for violence found in the ring's both purpose and income. One fragmentary papyrus tells the story of a quarry worker named Amenhotep, who gained reputation as an unbeatable fighter. The text describes how he won 12 consecutive bouts, earning enough money to buy freedom from his labor obligations. He used his winnings to open a beer house, achieving the kind of social mobility that legitimate work would never have provided. Then he went back to the ring for one more fight, accepting a wager too large to refuse. His opponent killed him. The beer house went to his creditors. The contests evolved beyond simple fist fighting. Texts mention bouts with knives, with staffs, even with chains. The most elaborate fights involved animals. Men fought dogs. Men fought each other while avoiding tethered predators. The skeleton with the bite marks might have participated in such spectacles, survived the animal, but eventually succumbed to accumulated damage from dozens of fights. Betting pools sometimes included human stakes. Ostraca record wagers, where losers agreed to work for winners for specified periods, effectively becoming temporary slaves. One document describes a man who wagered himself for an entire year, lost, and spent that year laboring for the winner in addition to his regular work obligations. The desperation required to make such bets suggests these were men already drowning, willing to risk everything on one chance to escape their circumstances. Fixed fights represented the darkest evolution. Several texts hint at fighters being secretly drugged before bouts, given substances that weakened them or slowed reactions. One particularly detailed account describes a popular fighter who lost unexpectedly, then died hours later vomiting blood. Investigation supposedly revealed he'd been poisoned before the fight, ensuring a specific outcome for gamblers who'd wagered enormous sums. The perpetrators were never identified. The betting continued. Violence as entertainment. Violence as commerce. Violence as escape from the violence of daily existence. And for those who lacked even the physicality to fight, or the courage to risk their bodies, other industries existed, equally dark, equally profitable, trading not in blood, but in the most fundamental human commodity of all. The papyrus contract seemed like a simple loan agreement, standard terms for borrowed grain during a difficult harvest. The handwriting was professional, the legal formulas correct, the witness signatures properly placed. Then translators reached clause 17, written in smaller script near the bottom. Should the debtor fail payment by the agreed date, the creditor may claim compensation through removal of the debtor's left hand to be sold at market value against the outstanding sum. This wasn't hyperbole. This was literal contractual permission for mutilation as debt collection. Egyptian law provided mechanisms for recovering debts through seizure of property or labor, but between law and practice existed a vast grey space where collectors operated with methods that would never appear in official documents. These men weren't government officials. They were private enforcers hired by creditors who'd grown tired of waiting for legal processes that moved slowly when they moved at all, and they understood that fear collected debts more effectively than patience. Torture left evidence in court records, filed by victims brave or foolish enough to complain. One case from Deir el-Medina describes a man named Panib who owed gambling debts to a tavern owner. When payment didn't come, the owner hired a collector who tied Panib to a post in public and beat him with wooden rods until he confessed the location of hidden valuables. Another document mentions a woman whose husband owed money. The collector burned her feet with hot coals, until she revealed where her family kept their grain stores. The cases that reached courts were exceptional. Most victims had no recourse, no voice, no power to challenge the system that crushed them. Some collectors specialized in psychological terror. They used magic, or the appearance of it, to break debtors' will. Court testimony describes a collector who placed cursed figurines at debtors' doorsteps, claiming supernatural forces would destroy their families unless payment arrived. Whether the magic was real mattered less than the fear it produced. People paid to stop the curses, even when they couldn't afford food. The debt trade itself became commerce. Collectors bought debt contracts from original creditors at discounted rates, then extracted full value plus interest from debtors. These contracts changed hands multiple times, creating chains of ownership where debtors no longer knew who they owed or how much the debt had grown through accumulated interest. One papyrus fragment shows a gambling debt of 3 deben that, through sales and interest, became 15 deben owed to someone the original debtor had never met. Children became collateral when adults had nothing left to pledge. Contracts explicitly allowed creditors to claim offspring as payment, assigning years of labor based on debt size. One heartbreaking ostrakon records a father's letter begging a creditor to release his daughter, promising payment he clearly couldn't provide. The creditor's response, if there was one, doesn't survive. Archaeological evidence suggests private imprisonment of debtors in homes with concealed cells, small spaces with shackle points worn into stone walls, barely large enough for a human body to crouch. The most devastating discovery came from a cave outside Thebes, where 7 bodies were found arranged in a circle, each with self-inflicted wounds. Nearby lay pottery shards listing debts, totaling amounts impossible to repay in their lifetimes. They'd chosen death together, rather than face collectors or watch their families enslaved. The cave was sealed deliberately, suggesting someone, family perhaps, knew what happened and tried to provide burial without acknowledging how these men died. This was the end point of vice economics. Drugs led to dependency. Sex cost money. Gambling created debt. Debt summoned collectors, and collectors extracted payment through means that made the original vices seem innocent by comparison. But individual suffering, terrible as it was, sometimes paled before collective madness. The moments when entire communities abandoned restraint during festivals that became orgies of excess. The festival was supposed to recreate how Hathor saved humanity through divine intoxication. According to myth, when Ra sent the goddess to destroy mankind for their rebellion, she became drunk on red beer that looked like blood and spared humanity in her stupor. The festival of drunkenness commemorated this salvation through ritual intoxication. Temples opened their doors. Beer and lotus wine flowed freely. Participants were expected to drink until they could barely stand, recreating Hathor's divine drunkenness. But what happened when the sunset was anything but divine? The festival occurred annually at Dendera, Hathor's primary cult center, and spread to temples throughout Egypt. Official accounts describe orderly ceremonies where priests led hymns and offerings. The reality preserved in less formal documents tells a different story. A papyrus fragment, written by a temple guard named Hori, describes his night shift during the festival around 1180 BCE. His words carry exhaustion and barely concealed horror. By the 3rd hour after sunset, we could no longer maintain order. The courtyards had become something else. People drinking until they vomited, then drinking more, fighting over nothing, coupling openly where children play during daylight. The priests had retreated to inner sanctums and locked the doors. Archaeological excavations of festival grounds reveal the scale of excess. The sacred lake at Dendera, meant for ritual purification, shows evidence of mass use during festivals. Pottery sherds, suggesting thousands of vessels. Organic residue indicating people bathed, urinated, and worse in waters considered holy. The surrounding structures contain small rooms, barely larger than closets, built along the outer temple walls. These weren't tea storage spaces. They were private chambers where wealthier festival goers could retreat with companions, paying temple administrators for temporary use of sacred property for decidedly unsacred purposes. The intoxication wasn't tea purely recreational. Chemical analysis of residues from festival vessels shows combinations of alcohol with lotus extracts and other substances at concentrations designed to obliterate consciousness. Participants weren't just drunk, they were experiencing altered states that erased inhibition, judgment, and memory. In this condition, normal social boundaries dissolved completely. Men and women who would never speak to each other during daylight hours became entangled in ways that violated every rule about class, marriage, and propriety. The darkness and the crowd provided anonymity. The substances provided justification. The religious context provided cover. Victorian archaeologists working at Egyptian sites encountered hieroglyphic graffiti in festival areas that they refused to translate in published reports. Their journals, discovered decades later, reveal why. The inscriptions described acts and combinations of participants that shocked men who seen everything the British Empire had to offer in terms of colonial decadence. One archaeologist wrote that the graffiti suggested festivities that would make Caligula blush. The inscriptions have since been photographed and translated, confirming that festival participants documented their activities on temple walls with the same casualness. Others might record a meal. Temple organizers profited enormously from the chaos. Account ledgers show festival income rivaling regular temple operations. Sales of specially prepared lotus wine generated massive revenue. Rental of private rooms commanded premium prices. Even the aftermath created income. Temple workers cleaned the sacred spaces and sold whatever valuable items drunk participants left behind. The religious establishment publicly condemned excess, while privately ensuring it continued, because the festival of drunkenness filled temple coffers more effectively than any amount of pious donations. But some festival goers never made it home. Mass graves near festival sites contain bodies showing signs of acute poisoning, blunt trauma, and drowning. Some deaths were probably accidental, people too intoxicated to avoid danger. Others suggest something more deliberate. Several bodies show injuries consistent with ritual violence, arranged in positions that imply ceremony rather than accident. Whether these were participants in extreme rituals who went too far, or victims of something darker hiding within the festival's chaos, remains unclear. What is certain is that families filed missing person reports after every festival, and not everyone who entered Hathor's celebration emerged when dawn broke. The festival's transformation from sacred ritual to sanctioned chaos reveals how quickly religious observance could become its opposite when oversight disappeared and substances flowed freely. And if this happened during officially sanctioned festivals, what occurred during the truly forbidden gatherings that had no divine justification? Every year, on the same night, archaeological records show a spike in violent deaths. Bodies appear in locations they shouldn't be. Injuries suggest deliberate violence rather than accidents. Property damage concentrates in specific areas. Yet official records from those exact dates consistently note that nothing unusual occurred. The pattern repeats across decades, always the same night according to the lunar calendar, always the same silence from authorities. Something happened during those hours that Egypt's scribes refused to document. Magical texts provide the first clues through deliberate omissions. Several papyri describing yearly rituals skip over one specific date, leaving blank space where text should be. In one case, a scribe started to write something, then scraped it away and left the papyrus empty. Chemical analysis of the scraped area reveals traces of ink forming words. The night when set rules and order sleeps. Other texts refer cryptically to the backwards time, or the inversion hours, without explaining what these phrases mean. The consistency of avoidance suggests shared knowledge of something too dangerous to record directly. A worker's diary from Deir el-Medina provides more concrete information. The writer, whose name is lost to damage, describes preparing for a night he calls "when the world turns over." He mentions constructing a temporary shelter outside the village, gathering masks made from papyrus and mud, and collecting items that represent those who press us down. The entry ends with, "Tomorrow we become them, and they become us, and what happens in backwards time stays in backwards time." The following entry, dated 5 days later, mentions cleaning blood from his tools and burning clothing. There is no explanation for the gap. Archaeological evidence suggests organized events requiring significant preparation. Surveys of desert areas outside major settlements have discovered remains of temporary structures built in patterns, suggesting large gatherings. The structures appear suddenly in the archaeological record, are used intensely for brief periods, then disappear. Dating places these events on the same lunar date each year. Near the structures, excavations find broken pottery, burned remains of effigies, and disturbing concentrations of human bones showing perimortem trauma. The festival's purpose was inversion of cosmic order. Everything Marat declared proper became improper. Everything forbidden became mandatory. Slaves gave orders to masters who obeyed or faced consequences. Women commanded men in public displays of reversed hierarchy. The young judged the old. Workers became pharaohs for a night, complete with mock thrones and forced obeisance from whoever they designated as temporary subjects. Property changed hands through force rather than law. Sacred objects were deliberately profaned. Every boundary that structured Egyptian society dissolved for those hours. Masks were essential. Participants covered their faces with crude constructions designed to hide identity, while suggesting transformation into something other than human. Animal faces were common. Set's distinctive profile appeared frequently, along with crocodiles, jackals, and mythological hybrids. The anonymity allowed people to act without fear of later recognition. What you did while masked and in backwards time theoretically stayed there, forgotten when order reasserted itself at dawn, but some actions couldn't be undone. Property destroyed, stayed destroyed. People injured during the night bore those injuries into daylight, and some participants never saw dawn. Mass graves near suspected festival sites contain bodies dated to these specific nights. The injuries are consistent with mob violence. Multiple blunt force impacts, evidence of restraint, signs of torture. Several bodies show signs that suggest ritual elements, positioned deliberately rather than discarded randomly. Whether these were authority figures who became targets of legitimate rage, or random victims of chaos, spiraling beyond anyone's control, the bones don't reveal. The authorities' response was studied ignorance. Acknowledging the festival meant acknowledging the hatred it expressed, the social pressures requiring such violent release. Better to let it happen in controlled bursts than risk constant rebellion. Better to clean up aftermath and record nothing than to confront why thousands of people needed one night annually to become monsters. The cosmic order returned each dawn. The dead could be buried quietly, and official history remained unblemished by truths too ugly to acknowledge. But some who participated in these nights of chaos found that temporary lawlessness wasn't enough, and they built permanent structures of crime that operated year-round. The orphanage records called them children of joy, but the brand on their foreheads marked them for a lifetime of shame. The mark was small, easily hidden by hair in childhood, but impossible to ignore as adults entered public life. It identified them as festival, born conceived during nights of chaos, when normal rules dissolved and paternity became unknowable. These children were Egypt's invisible population, documented in records that acknowledged their existence while denying them legitimacy, future, or place in cosmic order. The numbers tell a grim story. Administrative documents from major temple complexes show spikes in orphanage admissions exactly 9 months after major festivals. The Dendera temple records from a single year mention, accepting 43 infants of unknown father in the month, following the expected gestation period from the festival of drunkenness. Not all festival pregnancies ended in orphanages. Wealthy women could hide pregnancies or claim early births, but poor women, especially unmarried ones, had few options. The children they bore were permanent evidence of participation in activities that violated every social norm. Society treated these children with systematic cruelty. They couldn't inherit property, they couldn't serve in temples or hold administrative positions. Many trades refused to accept them as apprentices. The brand they received in infancy marked them as corrupted by their origins, as though chaos itself had entered their blood during conception. One heartbreaking letter preserved on papyrus describes a young woman named Nefertiti writing to her birth mother, a respected priest's wife, pleading for recognition. "I know you are my mother. I have your eyes, your hands. I know the night I was made. Please acknowledge me." The mother's response, if it existed, doesn't survive. But 2 months later, both women were found dead. Official records called it suicide. The circumstances suggest otherwise. Underground networks emerged to exploit these children. Traffickers purchased infants from desperate mothers, paying amounts that seemed generous to the destitute but were calculated against future profits. Boys were sold to mines and quarries where life expectancy made long-term investment pointless. Girls disappeared into brothels, their branded status making them unmarketable for legitimate marriage and therefore permanently available for commercial use. Court records mention occasional prosecutions of these traffickers, but the sentences were light and the practice continued because demand existed and supply was constant. Some children met even darker fates. Archaeological excavations near festival sites have revealed unusual infant burials, bodies interred without proper ritual, sometimes in groups, often showing signs of deliberate harm. Chemical analysis of one mass burial, containing 17 infants, revealed traces of toxic substances in bone samples, suggesting poisoning. Whether these were unwanted children killed by desperate mothers, victims of traffickers eliminating unsold inventory, or something worse, remains uncertain. What is clear is that festival babies died at rates far exceeding normal infant mortality. Those who survived childhood often turned to crime, having no legitimate paths available. Criminal records from Thebes mention a gang called the Unmarked, despite its members all bearing the festival brand. They specialized in robbery and extortion, targeting the very temples where festivals occurred. Their leader, a man named Panassi, left a confession after his capture that reveals both intelligence and rage. "We are children of the gods' chaos, born when order slept. They brand us for what our parents did in darkness, so we bring darkness to their daylight world." The most disturbing evidence suggests some festival children formed a secret society, dedicated to destroying the system that rejected them. Fragmentary texts describe a group calling themselves Children of Set, organizing across multiple cities, planning coordinated attacks on temples during festivals. Whether these plans were ever executed remains unclear, but the paranoia they inspired appears in administrative records, warning of branded ones gathering in suspicious numbers during festival preparations. The authorities' solution was predictable: increased persecution of festival children, creating exactly the desperation and hatred that drove recruitment to these groups. The cycle was self-perpetuating. Festivals created children, children faced systematic abuse. Abuse created criminals, criminals justified further persecution. And every year, new festivals created new generations, marked from birth as less than human, feeding criminal networks that had evolved from temporary chaos into permanent institutions of organized violence. The bread smelled perfectly normal, but everyone who ate from that particular batch was dead within 3 days. The baker's wife, a woman named Mutamwia, had delivered loaves to 17 households over the course of 5 years. Each delivery was a gift, a gesture of friendship or apology or simple neighborliness. Each loaf contained carefully measured amounts of oleander extract, ground so fine it was invisible in the grain, present in quantities too small to taste, but sufficient to damage hearts slowly, irreversibly. When Mutamwia was finally caught, her kitchen revealed compartments hidden within walls, each containing dried plants and prepared powders that could end life in ways that looked like natural causes. Women controlled food in ancient Egypt. They ground grain, baked bread, meals, brewed beer. This domestic authority was absolute and unquestioned. Husbands ate what wives prepared. Children consumed what mothers provided. And in a world without food safety testing, where sudden death from contaminated food was common enough to seem unremarkable, deliberate poisoning could hide behind tragic accident. The knowledge passed quietly between women who understood that power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Medical papyri preserve descriptions of deaths that troubled ancient physicians. Patients who sickened slowly over weeks, losing strength and appetite, experiencing pain that had no visible cause. Others who died suddenly after meals, their symptoms suggesting heart failure or stroke. The texts describe treatments, none effective, because the physicians didn't understand they were observing murder rather than disease. But some physicians suspected. One papyrus fragment describes a doctor questioning a widow about her husband's diet in the weeks before his death, asking specifically what his wife had been feeding him. The text breaks off before revealing conclusions, but the questions themselves suggest awareness that kitchens could be crime scenes. The plants grew everywhere. Oleander lined the Nile, beautiful and deadly. Castor beans provided oil for lamps and poison for enemies. Henbane grew in gardens, useful for legitimate medicine in careful doses and murder in slightly larger ones. Certain mushrooms appeared seasonally, indistinguishable from edible varieties, except to those who knew. Women who maintained household gardens could cultivate death alongside vegetables, and no one would question why they grew plants that had legitimate uses alongside their lethal properties. Recipes existed, though not in official texts. These were passed orally, demonstrated rather than written, shared in whispers between trusted individuals. Archaeological discoveries of pottery shards with abbreviated instructions suggest some women risked documentation. One ostrakon lists ingredients and proportions that, when analyzed by modern toxicologists, constitute a reliable method for creating tasteless poison that causes symptoms resembling common illness. Another fragment describes steeping specific leaves in wine for precise durations, creating a preparation that would stop a heart within hours, while appearing to be natural death. Hidden compartments in kitchen areas tell their own story. Excavations of houses in workers' quarters sometimes reveal spaces within walls, accessible only through knowledge of hidden mechanisms. These weren't storage for valuables. They contained vials of prepared substances, dried plants wrapped carefully in linen, and small tools for grinding and measuring. One particularly elaborate example from a house in Deir el-Medina included a compartment holding 7 different preparations, each labelled in a private shorthand the excavators couldn't decipher. The house belonged to a woman who outlived 3 husbands and accumulated unusual wealth for someone of her social position. Hieratic texts hint at organized networks. A damaged papyrus describes what it calls a circle of protection, where women met to share knowledge and provide alibis for each other during investigations. The text suggests these groups operated across multiple communities, with members communicating through seemingly innocent exchanges of recipes and household advice that actually conveyed coded information about techniques and targets. When authorities investigated one suspicious death, the circle ensured witnesses supported innocent explanations, creating collective stories that made prosecution impossible. The motivations varied, but shared common roots in powerlessness. Women trapped in brutal marriages with no legal escape, mothers whose children were threatened by abusive fathers, daughters protecting siblings from predatory relatives, workers whose families faced starvation because overseers stole rations. The cosmic order promised justice, but justice moved slowly if at all. Poison offered immediate solutions to problems that official channels ignored, and poverty made the choice stark: accept suffering or remove its source through the only means available. Mutimwea's confession, extracted through methods courts preferred not to record in detail, revealed her motives. 13 of her 17 victims had wronged her family directly: an overseer who beat her son, a merchant who cheated her husband, neighbors who spread vicious rumors. The other 4 she killed for payment, accepting contracts from other desperate women who lacked the knowledge or courage to act themselves. She wasn't an aberration, she was part of an industry, one that operated quietly but persistently, turning household skills into commercial murder. The embalmer's workshop looked normal from the outside, but the hidden room contained bodies that were far too fresh to be legitimate clients. When authorities raided the establishment in Thebes around 1160 BCE, they expected to find stolen burial goods, the usual crime associated with death workers who had access to valuables. Instead, they discovered 6 corpses in various states of dismemberment, none showing signs of proper mummification preparation. The embalmer, a man named Userhat, initially claimed these were bodies awaiting processing, but the dates on his official client records didn't match. These corpses weren't meant for burial. They were inventory waiting for buyers who needed human remains for purposes the law didn't permit. Ancient Egypt's obsession with death created massive industries: embalmers, coffin makers, tomb builders, priests who performed funeral rites, all profited legitimately from mortality's certainty. But alongside this official economy operated a shadow market, trading in corpses themselves. Medical practitioners needed bodies to study anatomy, though official doctrine limited such study. Magicians required human remains for spells that promised extraordinary power, and certain clients simply wanted bodies for reasons they preferred not to explain. Where demand exists, suppliers emerge. Embalmers occupied perfect positions to exploit this market, They handled bodies legally, had facilities for storage and processing, and could explain away suspicious activities as normal business operations. Some, like User Hat, developed sophisticated fraud. When families brought loved ones for mummification, these embalmers performed abbreviated rituals while setting aside organs and sometimes entire bodies for resale. The families received bundles wrapped in linen, weighted with sand and scrap materials, never knowing their relatives had been diverted to other purposes. Discovery was unlikely. Once buried, no one examined the contents of mummy wrappings. The pricing structure reflected grim calculations. Children's bodies commanded premium prices for certain magical applications based on beliefs about innocence and untapped life force. Bodies of executed criminals were valuable for curses requiring the essence of violent death. Diseased corpses, particularly those who died from specific conditions, sold to practitioners who believed pathology concentrated magical properties. One fragmentary price list recovered from a raided workshop shows a child's body valued at 15 Deben, while an elderly person rated only 3 Deben. Age, health, and manner of death all affected market value. Medical students operating outside official channels constituted a significant customer base. Egyptian medicine was advanced, but religious restrictions limited how much physicians could learn from actual human anatomy. Some practitioners circumvented these restrictions by purchasing bodies for private dissection. A letter preserved on papyrus describes a physician bargaining with a supplier requesting a fresh subject, intact, for study of internal structures. The casual tone suggests this was routine commerce, not exceptional crime. Archaeological evidence reveals the scale. Excavations of certain areas outside major settlements have uncovered mass graves containing hundreds of bodies showing unusual patterns, missing organs that weren't removed through mummification processes, dismemberment that doesn't match any known burial practice, combinations of remains suggesting bodies were sorted and stored rather than respectfully interred. Chemical analysis indicates these burials span decades, suggesting ongoing operations rather than one-time events. The darkest accusations involve deliberate harvesting. Court testimony in multiple trials mentions rumors of establishments that house the destitute and homeless ostensibly as charity. These facilities provided shelter and food to people society ignored: the sick, the elderly, those without family. But according to witnesses, residents who entered these places disappeared at convenient times, their bodies never properly buried, but instead diverted to the corpse trade. One witness claimed to have seen living people marked with symbols indicating buyer interest, essentially tagged like inventory, before being killed. Whether these corpse farms actually existed or represented paranoid exaggeration of actual body trading operations remains debated among scholars. What is certain is that enough people believed they existed to create widespread fear. Parents warned children away from certain charitable institutions. The homeless avoided shelters in specific districts, and the fear itself suggests that even if the most extreme accusations were false, the underlying trade was real enough to make such horrors seem plausible. For some merchants, waiting for natural death was simply too inefficient when murder could meet demand more reliably. The construction foreman thought he was hiring day laborers, but the workers who showed up were shopping for something else entirely. Victims whose disappearance wouldn't be noticed. Major building projects in ancient Egypt drew migrants from across the kingdom, desperate men seeking temporary work. They arrived without family, without connections, without anyone who would file reports if they never returned home. For certain individuals monitoring these labor pools, these workers weren't potential employees. They were opportunities, bodies waiting to be purchased, killed, and hidden where they'd never be found. Murder for hire wasn't an occasional crime committed by desperate individuals. It was an organized industry with established pricing, reliable practitioners, and sophisticated methods for avoiding detection. The evidence appears in coded messages scratched on pottery shards, found in houses of known criminals, and decoded only after years of scholarly analysis. One ostrakon lists what appear to be grain prices but uses terms that don't match any known agricultural products. 5 for the quick harvest, 10 for the slow harvest requiring special tools, 20 for the harvest that must look natural. The code was simple once understood. The numbers represented Deben. The harvests were lives. The special tools were poisons or methods requiring expertise beyond simple stabbing. The pricing reflected both risk and skill. A straightforward murder knife in darkness, body disposed in the Nile, cost around 5 Deben, approximately 2 months of a labourer's wages. Murders requiring special circumstances cost more. A death that needed to appear accidental ran 10 Deben. A killing that had to happen in a specific location at a specific time could cost 15. And deaths that required ritual elements, whether for the killer's beliefs or the client's requests, commanded premium prices reaching 20 Deben or higher. One killer operated for over a decade before his capture. Horemheb was a Wab priest, bound by purity laws and expected to maintain ritual cleanliness. His religious position provided perfect cover. He travelled between temples legitimately, had excuses for being anywhere at any time, and his social status meant few questioned his movements. But bodies began appearing at locations Horemheb had recently visited, each marked with identical cuts across the chest, forming a pattern that eventually was recognized as a corrupted version of protective hieroglyphs. His confession revealed a mind that had twisted religious knowledge into justification for murder. He believed certain people disrupted cosmic order through their existence, and that killing them was holy work. But he also accepted payment for these services, apparently presented no contradiction in his theology. Construction projects provided ideal disposal methods. Foundation sacrifices were traditional in Egyptian building, symbolic offerings buried beneath structures to ensure stability and divine favor. But some builders realized that bodies hidden in foundations wouldn't be discovered until the building collapsed, which might take centuries. Court records mention an investigation into a temple construction where workers reported seeing bodies placed in foundation trenches that weren't part of official sacrifice rituals. The investigation was quietly closed, the temple completed, and those bodies remain entombed beneath sacred architecture to this day. Training created consistency. Examination of murder victims from different cities and different decades shows patterns suggesting taught techniques. Specific knife angles that severed major vessels efficiently. Precise strikes to locations causing rapid unconsciousness, followed by death. Methods for restraining victims that left minimal evidence. This wasn't amateur violence. This was professional killing passed through generations of practitioners who understood anatomy better than most physicians. A price list discovered in a raided criminal safe house detailed services with chilling specificity. Simple murder, 5 Deben. Murder disguised as accident, 10 Deben. Murder of a protected individual, 15 Deben. Torture before death, additional 5 Deben. Public execution to send messages, 25 Deben. The document included guarantees. If the victim survived, no payment required. If authorities connected the death to the client, the guild would eliminate witnesses. It was commerce treated with the same professionalism as any legitimate trade, but not everyone who dealt in death did so purely for profit. Some practitioners occupied the ambiguous space between healing and harming, wielding knowledge that could save lives or end them, depending on whose interests they served and how much they were paid. The healer promised to cure any ailment for half the temple physician's price. Patients didn't realize the cure often proved worse than the disease. Her name was Toret, and she operated from a house in the workers' quarter of Thebes around 1170 BCE. She had no official training, no temple certification, no priestly authority to practice medicine. What she had was desperate clientele who could afford legitimate physicians, some genuine knowledge acquired through observation and experimentation, and absolutely no oversight to stop her when treatments went catastrophically wrong. Official Egyptian medicine was sophisticated but expensive. Temple physicians trained for years, learning from medical papyri that documented centuries of accumulated knowledge. They diagnosed through examination, prescribed complex treatments, and performed surgeries that modern doctors recognize as genuinely advanced. But their services cost money most Egyptians didn't have. A temple physician might charge 10 Deben for treating a broken bone. For a family barely surviving on 15 Deben annually, that wasn't healthcare. That was choosing between healing and eating. Underground healers filled this gap with practices ranging from merely ineffective to actively lethal. Some were well-intentioned, but ignorant, applying folk remedies that did nothing beyond providing placebo comfort. Others, like Tarot, possessed real medical knowledge acquired through questionable means. Court documents describe her arrest after a patient died from infection following an abdominal surgery. She performed using a knife stolen from a temple. The knife was ceremonial bronze, consecrated for religious rituals, never meant to cut living flesh, but Tarot believed its sacred nature would prevent evil spirits from causing infection. The patient's gangrenous death proved otherwise. The tools these healers used tell disturbing stories. Excavations of suspected unlicensed surgery sites reveal collections of implements that range from legitimate medical instruments to improvised horrors. One cache found beneath a house in Memphis included bronze scalpels of professional quality, alongside crude iron hooks, bone saws clearly recycled from butchering animals, and needles made from sharpened reeds. The mixing of proper tools with improvised substitutes suggests practitioners who understood some medical principles while catastrophically misunderstanding others. The potions were particularly insidious. Medical papyri warn specifically against mixtures that promise all cures, recognizing that such claims indicate fraud. But desperate people ignore warnings when offered hope. Analysis of residues from vessels found in back alley healing establishments reveals combinations designed not to cure but to create dependency. Opium for pain relief, blue lotus for euphoria, various herbs for flavor, and sometimes disturbingly, traces of human blood added because practitioners believed it transferred life force from healthy donors to sick patients. The immediate effect was relief from symptoms. The long-term effect was addiction that kept patients returning and paying. Some practitioners maintained what they called research facilities in hidden rooms where they tested treatments on individuals who could refuse. Slaves purchased specifically for experimentation. Criminals whose families would question extended absences. Even children sold by destitute parents who accepted payment with the understanding that their offspring might not survive whatever treatments were being developed. One fragmentary text describes a healer justifying these experiments as advancing medical knowledge that would eventually help thousands. The text doesn't record how many died, so this knowledge could be gained. The most cynical operated on a business model of managed illness. They provided treatments that eased symptoms temporarily while ensuring the underlying condition persisted, guaranteeing continued patient dependence. A healer might treat an infected wound with a poultice that reduced pain and swelling while containing substances that prevented complete healing. The patient felt better, paid regularly, and never fully recovered. One investigation revealed a practitioner who'd kept a patient in this state for 3 years, collecting steady income from a condition that proper treatment could have cured in weeks. Court cases against these healers were rare. Victims were usually poor, lacking resources or social standing to pursue legal action. Successful prosecution required proving harm, difficult when patients died or suffered complications that might have occurred anyway. And many victims remained silent out of shame, unwilling to admit they'd sought treatment outside official channels. The healers understood this protection and exploited it ruthlessly, knowing that even their most catastrophic failures rarely faced consequences. Tarot's case only reached court because she'd made the mistake of treating a minor official's servant. When the woman died, her master had resources to demand investigation. The evidence found in Toret's house, the stolen sacred knife, jars of suspicious preparations, and testimonies from surviving patients, led to her execution. But her death changed nothing. Within months, another healer had taken over her former clients. The demand hadn't disappeared. It never would, as long as poverty made legitimate medicine unattainable, and desperation made people willing to trust anyone promising relief. And some claimed to heal not just bodies, but minds and spirits broken by existence, in a world that crushed hope as efficiently as it crushed grain. The man woke convinced the gods had commanded him to give his life savings to the temple. The dream had been vivid beyond anything he'd experienced before. Anubis himself had appeared, speaking in a voice that resonated through his bones, demanding the offering. The certainty felt absolute. Within days he'd transferred everything he owned to the priest, who'd arranged his sacred sleep. Only later, when poverty forced clarity, did he realize the only divine vision was the priest's greed, and the voice of Anubis had come from a speaking tube hidden in the wall behind his sleeping platform. Dreams held sacred status in ancient Egypt. People believed the gods communicated through visions during sleep, revealing futures and commanding actions. Legitimate dream interpretation was a respected skill, practiced by trained priests who studied centuries of accumulated symbolic meanings. But this reverence created opportunities for exploitation. If people believed dreams carried divine authority, then controlling dreams meant controlling people. And certain practitioners discovered methods of doing exactly that. The techniques varied in sophistication. The crudest involved simple suggestions. A client would arrive seeking guidance, describe their concerns, then pay to sleep in a sacred space where dreams would supposedly provide answers. Before sleeping, they'd consume a ceremonial drink. Wine mixed with herbs the priest claimed were blessed by specific gods. The herbs were actually combinations of substances that induced vivid hallucinations. Upon waking, disoriented and suggestible, clients would describe their visions. The priest would then interpret these drug-induced experiences as divine messages, always in ways that benefited the priest financially. More elaborate operations used environmental manipulation. Archaeological surveys of suspected underground dream temples have revealed chambers with remarkable acoustic properties. Spaces designed so that whispers spoken in hidden alcoves would carry to specific sleeping locations, seeming to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Combine these architectural features with drugged clients already primed to expect divine communication, and voices in the darkness became voices of gods. Instructions whispered while clients slept in altered states would be remembered as divine commands upon waking. One particularly successful dream thief named Amenhotep learned hypnotic techniques from Syrian traders who'd brought the knowledge from the East. His method required no drugs, just careful conversation and repetitive gestures. Court records from his trial describe how he'd meet with clients multiple times, each session involving increasingly focused attention on swinging pendants or repeated phrases. Eventually, clients would enter states where Amenhotep could implant suggestions they'd later remember as their own thoughts or divine revelations. One victim testified she'd given Amenhotep her family's land because she was absolutely certain the gods had told her to do so, only realizing years later that the certainty had been manufactured during these sessions. The blackmail potential was obvious. Clients who paid for dream interpretation often revealed embarrassing or incriminating information during their drugged visions. Some practitioners kept detailed records of these revelations, using them later to extract continued payments. Your dream revealed you stole from your employer. Pay me, or I'll report this divine revelation to authorities. The victim couldn't distinguish between what they'd actually done and what they'd confessed while hallucinating, making the blackmail devastatingly effective. Dream cults represented the most extreme exploitation. These groups would gather members for shared sleeping experiences, everyone consuming the same powerful hallucinogens, experiencing overlapping visions that reinforced each other's delusions. Members would wake convinced they'd collectively witnessed divine truths, creating shared false memories that became the foundation for cult beliefs. One such cult discovered near Thebes had convinced its members that they were secretly divine beings trapped in human form, that their true god had revealed this through shared dreams, and that liberation required specific rituals that happened to transfer members' wealth to the cult leaders. The authorities struggled to prosecute these crimes. How do you prove someone's dream was artificially induced? How do you distinguish between legitimate religious experience and manufactured manipulation? And if victims genuinely believed they'd received divine commands, were they victims at all? These questions meant most dream thieves operated with impunity, their practices continuing as long as human desperation for meaning and divine guidance exceeded skepticism. But some practitioners moved beyond manipulating minds to experimenting with bodies in ways that make dream theft seem almost merciful by comparison. The surgical cuts were so precise that modern surgeons initially refused to believe they were ancient. The technique required understanding of tissue layers that supposedly didn't exist until the Renaissance. The incisions followed paths that avoided major vessels, with accuracy suggesting detailed anatomical knowledge. But the cuts weren't trying to heal anything. They were attempting to reshape a human skull while the person was still alive, creating a deformation that served no medical purpose, except as proof that it could be done. The body was discovered in an unmarked grave outside Thebes, buried without ritual, without identification, without anything suggesting this person mattered to anyone. What made archaeologists take notice was the skull modification, deliberate surgical intervention creating an elongated shape that wasn't the result of childhood head binding practices. This was adult surgery, performed with bronze instruments on living bone, successful enough that the person survived for years afterward. Bone growth patterns indicated healing, but they also indicated a life of chronic pain from an operation that had no therapeutic justification. The physician behind such procedures left traces in fragmented texts that temple authorities tried to erase. His name was Amenemhat, and he'd been expelled from temple medical service for practices that violate the boundaries of healing. What those practices were becomes clear through papyrus fragments recovered from a hidden chamber beneath a house in Memphis. The texts describe surgical procedures in clinical language that modern doctors recognize as anatomically sophisticated but ethically horrifying. Attempts to transplant limbs from fresh corpses onto living patients. Experiments with trepanation, drilling into skulls, not to relieve pressure, but to access the seat of consciousness. Detailed notes on how long patients survived various interventions, recorded with the detachment of someone documenting crop yields. Some subjects were described as volunteers, though the reality was bleaker. Court records mentioned debt slaves, purchased specifically for medical purposes, their consent assumed because their masters had sold their bodies along with their labor. One fragment describes a procedure attempting what it calls transformation of form to match inner nature, language that suggests early attempts at gender modification through surgical intervention. Whether these operations succeeded or what happened to the patients isn't recorded. The absence of follow-up documentation suggests outcomes too catastrophic to preserve. Archaeological evidence supports the text's implications. Several bodies recovered from non-standard burial sites show surgical modifications that go beyond any known therapeutic practice. One skeleton displays evidence of a limb partially removed and reattached at a different angle. Another shows signs of abdominal surgery that removed organs and left the person alive long enough for partial healing. The precision of these interventions indicates knowledge of anatomy that challenges assumptions about ancient medical limitations. The darkest operations created deliberate deformities. Wealthy collectors apparently paid for human curiosities, living people modified to become spectacles. One text mentions a physician who specialized in creating wonders through controlled surgical intervention and strategic breaking of bones during healing. These modified individuals were sold to entertainment venues or private collections. Their deformities presented as natural rarities rather than manufactured abnormalities. The practice was profitable enough that multiple practitioners competed for clients. The hidden laboratory discovered in 1934 contained evidence that disturbed even experienced archaeologists. Preserved organs in sealed jars, far more extensive than any mummification cache. Surgical instruments of unusual design purpose, built for procedures that wouldn't be attempted again for thousands of years, and papyri containing surgical notes that modern physicians found both impressive and deeply unsettling. The techniques described showed genuine innovation. The ethics showed complete absence of concern for human suffering in pursuit of medical advancement. These flesh sculptors operated at the intersection of healing and harm, using legitimate knowledge for illegitimate purposes. They pushed boundaries that perhaps shouldn't to have been pushed, learned things that perhaps shouldn't to have been learned, and left behind evidence that makes us question how much we really understand about ancient capabilities and ancient cruelty. But if medicine offered one form of escape from the brutality of common life through the oblivion of drugs or the finality of death, ordinary Egyptians sought other escapes through spectacles that let them forget their existence for a few hours. The tooth marks on the skeleton told a clear story, but it was the gold coins still clutched in the severed hand that revealed why he'd entered the pit. The remains were discovered in a shallow grave near the Nile outside the workers' quarter of Memphis. The bones showed evidence of multiple healed fractures consistent with violent encounters. but the final injuries were catastrophic. A crocodile's death roll had torn his left arm completely from his body, yet even in death, his hand gripped 3 gold deben, the prize money he'd won moments before the animal's jaws closed on him for the last time. Egypt's elite enjoyed refined entertainment. Musicians, dancers, elaborate feasts where the worst danger was overindulgence, but commoners created spectacles that reflected their harsher reality, entertainment built around violence, risk, and the constant proximity of death that defined their daily existence, and nothing embodied this more than the blood sports that drew crowds, willing to pay for the visceral thrill of watching men fight creatures that evolution had perfected as killing machines. Crocodile wrestling wasn't sanctioned by any official authority. Temple doctrine held that certain animals were sacred, that Sobek the crocodile god deserved reverence, not mockery through combat spectacles. But doctrine didn't feed hungry families or provide escape from grinding poverty, so in spaces beyond official oversight, abandoned quarries, cleared patches of riverbank, modified animal pens near settlements, men faced crocodiles for money and the temporary fame that came with survival. The most successful wrestler was a man named Panhisi, whose career is documented through betting records and injury reports spanning 12 years. He fought his first crocodile at age 17, a juvenile specimen barely 6 feet long. He survived with minor lacerations and earned enough to feed his family for a month. The money was intoxicating. The crowds were addictive. He fought again and again. By the time he faced his 47th match, he was wrestling full-grown Nile crocodiles, exceeding 12 feet, animals capable of generating bite forces that could shatter bone like pottery. The betting systems around these contests were sophisticated. Basic wagers on outcomes, survival, death, or the dreaded taken, where the crocodile dragged the fighter into deep water and the body was never recovered. But wealthy patrons paid for blood rights, purchasing the privilege of keeping portions of whoever lost. A crocodile's teeth, prized for amulets. A fighter's hand, if recognizable enough to prove authenticity. The contracts were explicit about what parts belonged to whom, creating a futures market in potential death that made the actual combat almost secondary to the commerce surrounding it. Archaeological evidence suggests the crocodiles themselves were managed as livestock. Modified pens near worker settlements show design features specifically for housing large reptiles, reinforced walls, flooding channels, feeding areas. Some enclosures contained remains of multiple animals, suggesting breeding programs aimed at producing more aggressive specimens. One particularly disturbing find included juvenile crocodile skeletons, showing evidence of deliberate starvation before fights, making them more dangerous through desperation. Fixed matches represented the darkest evolution of the sport. Handlers could be bribed to drug animals before fights, making them sluggish and manageable. Fighters could be paid to lose, though this carried its own risks. A crocodile doesn't stop at stage defeat. Sometimes both sides were deceived, with animals secretly enraged through torture, or fighters unknowingly drugged to slow their reactions. One documented massacre occurred when a promoter accepted bribes from multiple gamblers wanting different outcomes, resulting in a fight where both the crocodile and the fighter were chemically altered in opposite directions. The animal's aggression was enhanced, the man's coordination was impaired. The result was predictable and profitable for everyone except the fighter's family. Panhisi died on his 48th match. The crocodile was larger than usual, and something in its behavior suggested it had been tampered with. Handlers reported difficulty controlling it before the fight. When Panhisi entered the pit, the animal attacked with unusual ferocity. The fight lasted less than a minute. His body, or what remained of it, was pulled from the water 3 days later. The promoters kept the gate receipts, claiming funeral expenses. His family received nothing. But if watching men fight animals provided one kind of thrill, an even darker entertainment existed where humans fought each other, not in spontaneous brawls, but in organized spectacles that made the fighting rings seem almost civilized by comparison. The training weapons were heavier than combat versions, designed not to kill, but to build strength through exhaustion and pain. The bronze practice blade discovered beneath a house in Thebes weighed twice what any fighter would carry into actual combat. Its edges were deliberately dulled, but the weight distribution was perfect, forcing muscles to adapt to resistance that would make real weapons feel effortless by comparison. and the blood stains worked into the handle's leather wrapping proved that training drew blood long before anyone entered a pit. The facilities existed in plain sight, disguised as legitimate athletic schools. Egyptian culture celebrated physical prowess. Wrestling was a respected skill. Young men trained in combat techniques for personal development and potential military service. But certain establishments operated with different purposes, their students preparing not for warfare, but for blood sports that had nothing to do with defending Egypt. The line between legitimate training and preparation for illegal combat was thin, deliberately blurred, and crossed the moment money changed hands based on survival rather than skill development. Recruitment targeted the desperate. Young men from families crushed by debt, seeing no future in legitimate trades. Orphans who'd aged out of institutional care with no prospects. Workers whose bodies had been damaged by labour, leaving them unable to perform their original trades, but still possessing strength that could be weaponized. The recruiters promised training, housing, and opportunities to earn money through their physical abilities. What they delivered was systematic brutalization designed to transform human beings into instruments of violent entertainment. The training methods broke people down before building them back, according to arena requirements. Trainees endured hours of physical conditioning that left muscles screaming and joints damaged. They fought each other with practice weapons until blood flowed and bones cracked. They learned to accept pain as normal, to function through injuries that would incapacitate people who hadn't been conditioned to push beyond normal human limits. And they learned, crucially, to suppress instincts for self-preservation that would make them hesitate in actual combat. Archaeological evidence reveals the scale of these operations. Excavations of suspected training facilities show spaces modified specifically for combat instruction. Stone floors worn smooth from thousands of hours of bare feet, moving through fighting stances. Marks on walls consistent with weapons, striking repeatedly during practice. Drainage systems suggesting the need to regularly wash away blood. And living quarters cramped enough to house dozens of trainees in conditions that made actual combat seem like escape rather than additional suffering. The transition from training to combat was gradual and calculated. Promising trainees would be tested in minor bouts against animals or inexperienced opponents. Those who survived advanced to more dangerous contests. Those who died were replaced by the constant stream of desperate recruits, willing to trade their bodies for temporary escape from poverty. The training facilities were pipelines, feeding fighters into entertainment systems that consumed human life as fuel for spectator thrills. The owners of these establishments profited from every stage. They charged trainees for housing and food, creating debts that had to be worked off through fighting. They collected percentages from fighters' winnings. They sold fighters to arena operators who needed fresh bodies to replace those killed or too damaged to continue. And they maintained relationships with gambling networks that profited from the blood their training produced. Not all trainees survived to see actual combat. Some died during training from injuries or exhaustion. Others fled, though this carried risks. Owners often hired enforcers to retrieve runaways, bringing them back for punishment that served as lessons to others considering escape. And some, realizing what they'd committed themselves to, chose suicide over the path they'd been forced onto. These training grounds were foundational infrastructure in an economy built on human suffering, connecting multiple forms of vice into integrated systems where drugs, gambling, violence, and exploitation reinforced each other. The complete picture of this hidden economy reveals just how deeply forbidden pleasures had woven themselves into the fabric of ancient Egyptian life. The garden's flowers were beautiful, but their real purpose was to mask the smell of what happened in the pavilion at its center. Public punishment in ancient Egypt wasn't hidden behind prison walls. It occurred in open spaces where communities gathered, where justice became spectacle, and spectacle became entertainment for crowds who'd made the journey specifically to watch other human beings suffer. Egyptian law prescribed specific punishments for specific crimes: beatings for theft, mutilation for forgery, execution for murder or treason. These weren't meant to be private affairs. They were public demonstrations of Marat being restored, cosmic order reasserting itself through the suffering of those who disrupted it. But somewhere between official justice and mob entertainment, the line blurred until punishment became theatre and the condemned became performers in dramas they hadn't chosen. The locations were selected for visibility and capacity. open squares near markets where crowds naturally congregated, temple courtyards where religious authority could sanctify the violence, riverbanks where bodies could be easily disposed of afterward. Archaeological surveys of these spaces reveal modifications, suggesting frequent use, raised platforms providing better views, drainage systems for washing away blood, even carved stone benches for spectators who arrived early enough to claim seats. The beatings drew the largest crowds. A thief sentenced to receive lashes would be bound to a post in full view, stripped to the waist, and struck repeatedly while officials counted strokes aloud. The audience would watch each impact, hear each cry, see flesh split and blood flow. Some spectators brought food, treating the event like entertainment rather than justice. Children were encouraged to watch, taught that this was what happened to those who violated social order. The educational value supposedly justified the spectacle. Mutilations offered different appeal. A forger, caught falsifying documents, would have the offending hand severed in public ceremony. The accused would be restrained while an official explained the crime to assembled witnesses. Then came the actual cutting, performed with ceremonial blade, the hand displayed to the crowd before being disposed of. The victim would be released afterward, permanently marked, their disability serving as permanent advertisement of their transgression. The crowd's reaction varied. Some cheered, others watched in silent fascination, and a few turned away, unable to stomach the reality, despite having come specifically to witness it. Executions commanded the most attention. The condemned were paraded through streets before being brought to execution grounds. Methods varied: beheading for nobles, drowning for certain offences, impalement for crimes deemed especially heinous. Each method attracted its own audience. Drowning executions involved binding the condemned with stones and throwing them into the Nile, crowds lining the banks to watch bodies sink and occasionally resurface. Impalement, reserved for the worst transgressions, involved stakes placed in public locations where the dying would remain visible for days, their prolonged suffering considered proportional to their crimes. The psychology behind spectator attendance was complex. Some came believing they were fulfilling civic duty, witnessing justice to confirm social order's maintenance. Others sought vicarious satisfaction, watching punishment of people they believed deserved suffering, and some simply craved the visceral thrill of watching death, the adrenaline that comes from proximity to mortality without personal risk. But not all spectators were passive observers. Records suggest that crowds sometimes participated, throwing stones at the condemned, shouting insults, even rushing forward to strike additional blows after official punishment concluded. The mob energy could transform ordered justice into chaotic violence, with authorities occasionally losing control as spectators became participants in collective brutality. These punishment spectacles were threads in a larger tapestry of exploitation and suffering that defined common Egyptian life. Every vice we've explored, the drugs, the sex trade, the gambling, the violence, connected into an underground economy that transformed human desperation into profit for those willing to exploit it. Ancient Egyptian tax records show a puzzling gap. Official documents track grain allocations, beer rations, payments for labor. But when modern economists analyze household expenditures preserved on pottery shards and compare them to documented income, roughly 30% of workers' earnings disappear into undocumented spending. The money existed, people earned it, received it, possessed it, then it vanished from legitimate economic records. The answer to where it went was hidden in the garbage dumps of history, in the fragments of transactions that official scribes never recorded, because official scribes never acknowledged the economy those transactions supported. The underground market for forbidden pleasures wasn't a minor element of Egyptian commerce. It was a parallel economic system rivaling legitimate trade in scale and sophistication. Conservative estimates based on archaeological evidence suggest the drug trade alone involved at least 20% of the working population in some capacity. Users numbering in the tens of thousands, growers cultivating forbidden plants in hidden gardens, processors preparing substances for consumption, dealers moving products through distribution networks, enforcers protecting operations, and corrupt officials ensuring the entire system operated with minimal interference from authorities who officially condemned everything it represented. Money flowed predictably upward. A worker might spend 2 deben on lotus wine, a week's wages for a few hours of escape. That money travelled through dealers taking cuts, suppliers taking percentages, and eventually reached individuals who controlled entire distribution networks. These criminal kingpins accumulated wealth that would have made merchants envious and nobles uncomfortable. Archaeological excavations of certain houses in workers' quarters reveal hidden chambers containing treasures that shouldn't exist in those locations. Gold jewelry, imported luxuries, hoards of copper and silver that represent fortunes incompatible with legitimate income from that social level. Some Nome governors recognized opportunity in this underground economy. Rather than suppress activities they couldn't fully eliminate, they taxed them. Fragmentary administrative documents reference payments from alternative sources and supplementary collections in language deliberately vague but financially specific. These weren't bribes exactly. They were systematic taxation of illegal activities, creating parallel government revenue streams funded by the very vices official doctrine condemned. The arrangement was pragmatic, if deeply cynical. If people were going to engage in forbidden activities anyway, why shouldn't the government profit? The economic impacts extended beyond simple money flows. The underground economy created inflation in specific markets. When criminals accumulated vast wealth, they spent it, driving up prices for goods and services. Housing in areas near criminal operations became unexpectedly expensive. Food prices in certain districts exceeded rates that legitimate income could explain. Legitimate businesses found themselves competing against enterprises funded by drug money and gambling profits, unable to match prices or working conditions that illegal operations could offer by ignoring regulations. The justice system's corruption was inevitable. When criminal organizations possessed resources rivaling government budgets, they could purchase protection. Court records that do survive suggest selective prosecution. Small operators faced harsh penalties, while major criminals operated with suspicious immunity. Witnesses disappeared or changed testimony. Evidence went missing. Officials who pushed too hard found themselves reassigned to positions far from criminal centers. The system meant to maintain merit became participant in its disruption. Legitimate trade suffered as underground commerce flourished. Merchants operating legally paid taxes, followed regulations, maintained proper records. Criminal enterprises did none of this, giving them competitive advantages that made legitimate business increasingly difficult. Some merchants abandoned legal commerce entirely, joining underground networks where profits outweighed risks. Others struggled and failed, unable to compete against operations unburdened by legal constraints. The human cost manifested in declining productivity. Workers trapped in cycles of addiction and debt became less effective. A laborer who spent his wages on drugs couldn't afford proper food, weakening his physical capacity. A craftsman gambling away his income couldn't maintain tools, reducing his output quality. Families broken by vice-produced children who entered the workforce already disadvantaged, perpetuating poverty across generations. The aggregate impact across thousands of workers created measurable economic decline that historians traditionally attributed to other factors without recognizing the vice economy's role. The shadow economy's scale challenged the fundamental premise of Marat. The cosmic order promised that everyone occupying their proper place would create harmonious prosperity, but when substantial portions of the population participated in activities that violated that order, when forbidden pleasures generated wealth rivaling legitimate commerce, when corruption ensured that violations went unpunished, the entire philosophical foundation crumbled. The economic data reveals what official documents wouldn't admit. Ancient Egypt's social order wasn't undermined by external enemies or natural disasters. It was corroded from within by an alternative economy built on human weakness, desperation, and the eternal human appetite for escape from lives that offered too little pleasure and too much pain. The hieroglyphs on the temple wall were supposed to ensure eternal life, but the hands that carved them shook from withdrawal, and the spelling errors reveal minds destroyed by lotus wine. The inscription is in Medinet Habu, carved during the reign of Rameses III, meant to glorify the pharaoh's victories and secure his immortality through perfectly rendered sacred texts. But modern epigraphers examining the work closely have found mistakes that trained craftsmen shouldn't make. Symbols reversed, words misspelled, lines carved at inconsistent depth suggesting the artist's attention wavered during work. These weren't the errors of apprentices learning their trade. These were the mistakes of skilled workers whose abilities had been compromised by substances that made steady hands shake and sharp minds blur. The damage wasn't limited to individual workers, it cascaded across generations, each one more compromised than the last. Consider one family whose story emerges from documents spanning 80 years found at Deir el-Medina. The grandfather, Kemwasit, appears in records as a competent stonecutter who developed a gambling problem around age 40. He accumulated debts he couldn't repay, eventually selling his tools and his house. His son Amenhotep grew up in poverty, watching his father destroy the family. Unable to learn proper stonecutting because his father had sold the tools and couldn't teach through his addiction, Amenhotep turned to dealing drugs, the only profitable trade accessible without apprenticeship or capital. He accumulated wealth, but died young, probably from violence related to his business. His children appear in fragments as prostitutes and thieves, raised in an environment where normal family structures and legitimate work were foreign concepts. 3 generations from respected craftsmen to complete social collapse, the trajectory visible in official records that usually ignored such families. The pattern repeated across worker communities. Traditional crafts required years of training, knowledge passed from master to apprentice through patient instruction and careful practice. But craftsmen lost in drug stupors or gambling dens couldn't teach. Apprentices who spent nights in brothels or fighting pits couldn't focus during daylight training. Skills that had been refined over centuries started disappearing within decades. Archaeological analysis of artifacts shows measurable decline in craftsmanship quality during the late New Kingdom. Pottery becomes cruder. Metalwork shows less sophistication. Even royal construction projects display deteriorating standards, as though the pool of truly skilled workers had shrunk below the level needed to maintain previous excellence. Contemporary texts lamented what they were witnessing. One papyrus fragment records a master craftsman complaining that young workers seek quick silver from forbidden trades rather than patient gold from honest craft. Another describes how traditional workshops stood empty while vice industries thrived, young men preferring dangerous profits from criminal enterprises over secure, but modest incomes from legitimate trades. The choices were rational from individual perspectives. Why spend years learning pottery when drug dealing paid 10 times as much immediately? But aggregate those rational choices across thousands of workers and you get civilizational decline. Population records tell a grimmer story. Birth rates in worker communities declined measurably during periods when vice industries flourished. Disease spread through populations weakened by malnutrition and substance abuse. Sexually transmitted infections proliferated through prostitution networks. Violent deaths from gambling disputes and criminal conflicts removed people in their prime working years. Infant mortality rose as mothers damaged by drugs and disease gave birth to compromised children. The demographic impact compounded over generations, each cohort smaller and sicker than the one before. The children raised in this environment became adults who knew only dysfunction. Their normal was violence, exploitation, and addiction. They'd never seen healthy families, legitimate success, or communities functioning according to principles beyond survival and predation. When these damaged individuals became the bulk of the working population, when they were the ones who should have been building, crafting, defending, and maintaining Egyptian civilization, they simply couldn't. They lacked the physical health, mental stability, social cohesion, and learned skills that civilization requires. By the time external threats arrived, Libyans, Sea Peoples, eventually Alexander's Greeks and Roman legions, they weren't conquering the Egypt of the pyramids and great temples. They were conquering a society already hollowed from within, a civilization that had spent centuries consuming itself through vices that promised escape, but delivered only destruction. The conquest was almost anticlimactic. Egypt didn't fall to superior force. It collapsed under the weight of its own forbidden pleasures, and foreign powers simply walked into the ruins. The last hieroglyphic inscription in the workers' village wasn't a prayer or a name. It was a desperate plea scratched into stone by someone who'd watched everything collapse. The lotus has taken everything. The message appears on a doorway in Deir el-Medina, dated to the late 20th dynasty. one of the final texts written before the village was permanently abandoned. The handwriting is crude, barely legible, the work of someone either intoxicated or devastated, and surrounding that inscription are the physical remains of a community that had consumed itself. Houses standing empty, tools abandoned mid-task, and in the cemetery, graves packed with bodies that died within months of each other, suggesting some final catastrophe that even the fragmentary records don't adequately explain. The corruption hadn't stopped at common workers. By the late New Kingdom, even priests were compromised. Financial records show temple officials diverting resources to personal use. Inventory discrepancies suggest systematic theft of sacred materials later found in drug preparation sites and brothels. One investigation documented a high priest of Ammon who maintained secret involvement in the lotus wine trade, using temple storage facilities to hide merchandise. When confronted, he claimed he was gathering evidence against criminals. The evidence suggested otherwise. His execution barely registered in historical records, as though authorities preferred to quietly eliminate the problem rather than acknowledge how deeply corruption had penetrated supposedly sacred institutions. Worker communities that had functioned for centuries began failing completely. Villages descended into violence as drug-fueled disputes escalated beyond traditional conflict resolution. One settlement near Thebes shows archaeological evidence of sudden mass departure. Houses abandoned with possessions still inside, tools left in workshops, food rotting in storage jars. Something drove the entire population to flee simultaneously. Nearby mass graves, containing bodies with violent trauma, suggest what that something might have been. When vice industries collapsed local social structures completely, people scattered rather than remain in places where no order remained. Foreign invaders recognized opportunity in Egyptian dysfunction. When Libyans, Sea Peoples, and eventually Persians arrived, they found ready-made intelligence networks in the vice trades. Drug dealers knew which officials were corrupt and vulnerable to pressure. Brothels heard secrets from patrons who spoke carelessly in moments of vulnerability. Gambling operations understood which workers were desperate enough to betray employers for money. The very networks that had undermined Egyptian society from within became tools for external conquest. Egypt wasn't defeated through superior military force alone. It was infiltrated through weaknesses its own vices had created. The physical evidence of decline appears in unfinished monuments, tombs begun but never completed, their walls showing increasingly crude workmanship where they were worked at all. Temples with sections built to lesser standards than earlier portions, as though the knowledge or will to maintain quality had disappeared. Religious sites abandoned mid-construction, tools left rusting, scaffolding collapsing, the Egyptian obsession with preparing for the afterlife. The defining characteristic of their civilization was disrupted by vices that made people focus on escaping the present rather than securing eternity. Ancient prophecies had warned this would happen. Texts from earlier periods predicted that when Marat was violated systematically, when people abandoned cosmic order in favor of personal pleasure, the gods would turn away. Egypt would lose divine protection and fall to chaos. These prophecies were metaphorical, theological warnings meant to encourage moral behavior. But the late period texts reference them, literally writers, seeing prophecy fulfilled as foreign powers conquered and traditional Egyptian civilization dissolved. Whether gods actually abandoned Egypt is theology. That Egypt collapsed partly through self-inflicted damage from vice is history. The monuments remain. The pyramids still stand. The temples still proclaim eternal divine order. Tourists marvel at the grandeur, the engineering, the artistry, but beneath and behind those monuments existed the human cost. The workers who built them while destroying themselves through forbidden pleasures, the families ruined by gambling and drugs, the children sold into sexual slavery, the communities that collapsed into violence. Egypt's legacy includes both divine aspiration and very human failure, monuments to eternity, built by people desperately seeking escape from their present. Every great civilization contains seeds of its own destruction. The vices Egypt tolerated, the drugs, the violence, the sexual exploitation, the criminal networks existed because they provided relief from conditions that were otherwise unbearable. But relief became addiction, escape became prison, and solutions became problems worse than what they were meant to solve. The pattern isn't unique to ancient Egypt. It echoes through every society that has risen and fallen, including our own. where different substances and different vices serve the same eternal human needs that drove Egyptian workers to the lotus dealers 3,000 years ago. The monuments warn us if we're willing to listen to what they're really saying.